you get a ticket?
Yes.
got two.
Thank you.
Like
Thank
a
you.
driving ticket? No, for his permit for his.
Somewhere on the street lies my ticket.
Yes.
Somebody's gonna get out of that garage. Well, no, they can't. They gotta get stamped.
That's so fun. How are you? I never see, and I see you with coffee. You gotta decaffeinate
In
yourself.
the lectures, in the items of interest for this.
This is
now
Chai.
to-
Makes
Hi,
it fun not that
Susan.
bad.
You sound gorgeous, by the way.
Yeah,
That
that's
one
yours.
second I
bring
saw
that up.
the Mac, I was
Bring
like,
it up.
I wanted to know
is
what
that
was up.
bottle her son?
So we're
What's she
good.
doing
Okay.
with that?
No, there's nothing.
How's your cutie doing?
We're gonna get started.
Intellectual party.
Knowing, she's a knower.
We'll get started. The September 10th Planning Sustainability Commission. Today we have order of business, items of interest from the commissioners, consent agenda item, consideration of minutes from 8/13/2013 PSC meeting. Then we'll have three briefings, gentrification report by Tom Armstrong. Then we'll have a housing opportunity strategy, a briefing again. Tom, you're on again, I guess. And it's a Tom Armstrong show today, I guess, because the last item is complete neighborhood analysis by Tom Armstrong again. So, yeah, you've been busy.
He merits a raise, I would say.
So start order of business, and before we get started, I'd just like to note that in passing, Lee Perlman passed away. He was a fixture at our meetings and gave us a star and reported diligently on our goings and happenings in this commission, and certainly miss him. And if you have any comments you wanted to make, just let you know he had passed.
Well, I knew Lee even before I got here from his work in the neighborhoods when I was a neighborhood association officer. But there is a memorial service this weekend, I believe, on the 15th.
No, what I wanted to say, I was so struck. I have to say that that gentleman would always reach out to me whenever we had very difficult discussions, and I know we never want to talk about the 39th Street renaming, but he was a sweetheart during that whole process. And I was just awestruck with that happened. I'm going to go to the memorial on Sunday.
Great. Other items of interest from commissioners? Karen?
I have one. This morning I had a really nice opportunity to meet and chat with a Metro Councilman, Sam Chase, who I had not met before, and found out that he actually represents my neighborhood. So we had a good chat, and one of the things that I told him I'd like to bring to this group and that he is going to bring back to his group is that maybe in the spring we could have a joint kind of work session to discuss equity and equity lenses. I think that they're going through a process of developing one, and I know that we have, and we continuously discuss and hone and refine that. And we both would really love to have an opportunity to have our organizations come together and have that conversation.
Yeah.
Could
We
we
can,
arrange work on that?
I'm happy to check with staff there and we'll put something together in spring. Sounds good.
Thank
Okay.
you.
And one other thing from my standpoint is I'm on the Transit Equity Committee, but and part of that is TriMet is doing a transit enhancement for East County, and I've been talking with Joe Zinder about coordinating that transit equity study with planning and trying to get some coordination between TriMet and planning about how that study kind of evolves and our concerns about transit in East County. So,
Yep.
Other items? Susan?
I have 3 or 4 items. The first one is that in the spirit of joint meetings, we talked before about having a joint commission meeting with PDC. And when I was at the Portland Development Commission, 2 or 3 weeks ago, I talked with them a little bit about some other things, but we did bring up the idea of having a joint meeting, and they were very receptive to that. And so Julie has been working with their staff to try and do that in early November. And I'm thinking the topic would be the Central City Plan, looking at the West Quadrant charrette results and the charrette results around the Portland-Milwaukee Light Rail. Because I think those might be, one, they're substantive, and they're things that both commissions have a lot of play on. If there's other topics that you want to think about, why don't you let me know what those might be, and we could probably have some discussion about that at a later meeting, later in the month. But if you have ideas, either now or later, we could entertain those.
Okay.
Susan, it'd be really great, that's wonderful, and it'd be really great if that meeting could be a dialogue rather than a talk to, that we could really talk with each other about our individual functions and how they work together synergistically. Not just hear, reports about how it's going and what our responsibilities are. We thrash it out, so we know kind of where we're standing.
Okay.
as individuals.
Okay, so maybe at the officers' briefing sometime in the next month, we could look at coming up with, 3 to 5 questions that are sort of, that we pose to each commission, looking at, what it is you do, what is your primary function, how do you see that integrating with the work of the other commission, and talk about that first, but then also have some kind of a substantive discussion about probably the West Quadrant, I'm thinking.
Okay.
That works?
Sounds good.
Okay, on a related note, around the Central City Plan, there are several meetings coming up. One is on September 18th. The Light Rail Station Planning Work Group is on September 18th from 5 to 8. And then there are 3 more meetings coming up in September, October, and November. The West Quadrant Stakeholder Advisory Committee that Kat co-chairs, and those meetings are from 5:30 to 8:30 in the evening. I don't know if you have any additions about how that's going?
Unfortunately,
Oh,
I've been traveling, so I haven't been to a lot, but we did just have kind of a briefing gearing up for this next one. We're just starting to get into the concept diagram plan work, which we're really excited to get going on after kind of taking all the shred information and moving that forward. So I think we've got our work cut out for us for the next few meetings, and they're going to be really substantive, and so it'd be great to have anybody else who's interested join us.
Okay.
And a
Great.
third item is that in light of our interest on the issues of health, there is a new document that we've worked on with the Oregon Public Health Institute and some others, and it's a focus on multifamily apartments and how developers and property owners can make those apartments healthier, and both in new construction and in existing construction. And so you'll have a briefing on that at your next meeting at the end of September, but a couple days after that, they will be having a big open house and discussion, and I think it's going to be at David Douglas. So if anyone's very interested in it, let me know, and I'll send you all the information about that. Otherwise, you'll have a briefing on that. But it's been a great project with the Public Health Institute and with the city and with others, looking at both construction, things you can do in construction, and things you can do in terms of operation and maintenance. And I think it's going to be a really successful guide in terms of a lot of use.
Is the document online?
Not yet, but it will be, or is it?
It is, and actually the online version is what will be updated. I have hard copies for all of you that I'll be sending later this week,
Okay.
but I'll also send you the link to what's online, and that will be probably more useful than the hard copy.
Thanks.
Great.
Okay, thanks.
When we're looking at events, I would really like it if you would consider having some of them at Park Rose.
That would be great.
We have a lot of them at David Douglas. Would be really nice to share that.
We didn't, as I started to say that, I said, oh, Karen's going to comment. And I said, and we didn't schedule this one. I would love to do that.
That showcases our school district as well.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Share the love.
The love.
Howard.
Yes.
Just a quick word, Susan, at the CIC meeting, we saw a rollout of a new application that the staff have put together around Are we, the commissioner should
Yes.
surely see that. It's one of the
Yes.
most effective pieces of information I've ever seen.
So that is why
I mean, really,
Sandra
it's-
is here, because I wanted her.
Is that what you're going to show
Well, no,
us?
not right now, but I wanted her to give you a little update on the comprehensive plan.
I mean, I
and what-
spoke out of, then you shouldn't have showed it to
No,
those
this
other
is
guys.
great, because what Howard's referring to is something we're calling the MAP app, which is basically an application online that you can use that has, in the old days, we would have put skinny of, or, like tracing paper with every kind of layering of looking at building types and looking at age and income and looking at, where there are stormwater issues and where there are earthquake potential issues. And now we have all of that in layers, but it's all in this great application. So you can look at a property and find out all the things that are related to that one place. And we've been building it for a long time, and so we're going to roll it out.
It's amazing.
In the
It's
beginning of
really
October.
amazing.
Um,
You
And
can really hold these
Sandra-
people's feet to the fire. There's really good information in that app.
So I wanted Sandra to give you an update on that and the other things that we're doing as we're rolling out. We've gone from big Portland plan, and we're really down into the details, and it's pretty exciting.
Obviously, lots of excitement. So I'm here for the comp plan team today, and we did want to announce that we are rolling out part 2 of the working draft. So if you recall, when we were going to publish our public review draft for the public, we divided it into part 1, and we published the goals and policies in January. We heard a lot of feedback through the policy expert groups and from the general public. We had the workshops in the spring. So that work was wrapped up, and that document looked like this, if you recall. And so now part 2 is coming out, and the part 2 is the mapping and the CSP, so the Citywide Systems Plan. The Citywide Systems Plan looks like this. Here's a previous draft of it, and we will be updating this and publishing that the first week of October. And that's when we flip the switch on this exciting map app also that Susan was describing. So instead of doing all the trace papers, we have all those layers on there. We will have a work session with the commission on October 8th is what we have it scheduled on. So it's a daytime meeting, and we have the whole agenda, so we can spend a lot of time looking at it and discussing some of the policy proposals that are in there. So the exercise really was to look at the goals and policies we're proposing in part 1, and then say, okay, so we have these great policies about industrial sanctuaries, for example. Where does that apply on a map? And then taking and creating a map layer that shows where the industrial sanctuaries are. We have these centers and corridors policies. Okay, where's the map of the centers and corridors? Where are the map of the stormwater constraint areas? And then we all have the ability to turn those layers on and off and put them on top of each other. Staff has been working with each other as they have looked at each other's layers and said, wait a minute, there's some issue here, and have identified in what we're calling pop-ups, just little, kind of like a pop-up video or something, a little pop-up of, you'll notice these 2 things, and here's some choices that we have as a community to resolve this issue. So those are the 2 products that are coming out. One is the MAP app, and one is the Citywide Systems Plan. We have a lot of collateral information coming out too. One piece that we're working on is the companion guide, which helps the public navigate both of those documents and understand what the big questions we're posing with this phase of the project is. And we have a 2-track public outreach strategy. One is that we we're calling the dispersed public outreach strategy, where we're asking organizations to host us. So we're going to their regularly scheduled meetings to give them an overview of the MAP app and help them and kind of train them how to use it and how to make comments, because it has an online commenting ability. So you can go in and geographically specifically say, I think the center should move to the west this far. Tom's team doesn't want to hear that, but so there's that approach, and then we're also doing a district mapping conversations for between doing the goals and policies and rolling this out. We had district mapping conversations at each of the districts for people who want to engage at more of a district scale. And so we are setting those up also. So that's our 2-track approach this time. Public comment will be open until December 31st. So we're giving 3 months for all of this outreach approach. And I mentioned that we're having a work session here, and we're also having, as part of this, an all-PEG meeting. Many of the PEG members have been interested in talking to each other, and that is scheduled for October 18th, and the PEG members will be getting an email tomorrow asking them to save the date. We'll be having it in this room right here.
I was just kidding.
What were you saying?
I said I'm busy.
Oh, you're busy that day. It's a Friday. We found that Fridays generally work for people, for the PEG members. So we're really excited, as Howard said. It's pretty fun to be in there and
Yeah.
working at a geographic scale. And we're looking forward to your comments and your reactions to all of this.
I think an interesting point for anyone watching is that we did this without any consultants. We did this all in-house. And so we
Wow.
have some amazing staff that GIS and an amazing bunch of interns and others that did all the work. And so I'm just really proud of the staff in terms of the things. So you get to play
That's
with it,
great.
and you get to put sticky notes on it. There's electronic
Yeah.
sticky notes, everything that can pop up, and then we can gather them all by topic, and it's pretty fun.
Great. That is
That's
great.
awesome.
Yeah.
So we're going to get a link to that, Julie?
Well,
Yeah.
it'll be available October 1st. So
Oh,
we'll do
okay.
a full launch on October 1st,
Okay.
providing everyone with a link. And then October 8th, we'll be here to share it with you and have
Okay.
you guys talk about it. And then, of course, you can continue commenting all the way through
Okay.
October 31st. Of course, this isn't our formal proposal to the commission. So that's our public phase.
roles.
We will get our proposed draft together, which will be our formal proposal to the commission, very late spring of next year.
Okay.
So you talked about part 2. What's part 3?
There is no part 3 of the working draft. So the working draft is part 1 and part 2. Then we pull it all together, both the policies and the map and the infrastructure list. And then that's our proposal to the commission, which will be called the proposed draft. That's our formal, for the comprehensive plan.
And that will be in the spring.
We will publish in the spring is our hope. The citywide systems plan at that point will be recalibrated to be fiscally constrained and to be prioritized. At this point, that's not what's in here. It's a laundry list.
Catherine?
So
Is the map app or the systems plan linked to or integrated with Portland Maps?
not yet.
Is the thought that it will be?
Yes, we're trying to figure out we developed the map app specifically for this phase of the project. Once it's developed, because it poses a lot of issues, right? I mean, that's the whole purpose, is to describe what the issues are so we can resolve the issues. Portland Maps mainly has what the regulatory stance is and what the city policy is on those places. So we don't want to confuse the two, and we haven't quite figured out what the translation will be after adoption of the comp plan. But it's not linked right now.
I would think at a minimum, if you just provided a link to go to it, maybe through Portland Maps, just to kind of, as another tool to let people be aware it's there somewhere. As someone who's in Portland Maps all the time,
Okay.
it'd be great to just be able
Okay,
to jump
yeah.
from there to just kind of say, well, what's the city thinking about this area of town?
Great, that's a good idea. I'll talk to our GIS group about that.
Good.
Anything else?
Other questions? Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Consent agenda, meeting minutes from 8:13. Commissioner approval? Second? Is there a second? All in favor?
Aye.
Passed. This is a briefing gentrification report. Tom?
Yeah, so we have 3 briefings for you this afternoon. They all sort of fit nicely together, and it shows you some of the analysis that we're doing that underlies some of these larger policy decisions. It also shows off our great GIS staff that helps us sift through all of this data and pull it together. And so I'm going to start with the gentrification study. We had shown you some early versions of this work last winter, I believe, when we started to come out, but we have pulled it together in a report, released the report, and now it helps inform some of our comp plan update discussions about where we go. Just to remind everybody, this was a study. It really came out of a lot of issues and discussions that came up in the Portland Plan. And so we teamed with Professor Lisa Bates at PSU to do this study for us. It has really two pieces. The first piece that I'll get into is a mapping assessment about risk and where there are gentrification pressures and how we can be aware or more sensitive to those pressures. And then the second half was a survey of best practices across the country, looking for new tools that we could bring to Portland to try and address this issue. It's important to sort of define what we mean by gentrification, and we kind of struggled with this in the Portland Plan discussions and in subsequent public discussions about, some people see gentrification as just being sort of the natural sort of improvement of the neighborhood, increasing affluence of the neighborhood, and yet at a certain point, there is this displacement aspect to that, and the displacement of lower income households and the loss of affordability. And that's really what we mean in this study. And when we talk about gentrification, we use gentrification and displacement interchangeably, and to mean that displacement of lower income households from a neighborhood. And really what it comes to, or back to this, is what we have is a situation where we have what was an undervalued neighborhood that for some reason becomes desirable. And sometimes that's just the private market making, collective decisions and an accumulation of those private decisions. And sometimes it's in response to a public investment, a light rail line, a park, some sort of targeted public investment that results in the neighborhood becoming more desirable that leads to this. And so we're left with this challenge that we want to improve neighborhoods, we want to continue to do community investments that oftentimes makes neighborhoods more attractive. And so what we want to do is look at this and have the tools available to know that when we make those investments, what are some of those sort of impacts that could lead to rising housing costs and displacement. Coming out of the Portland Plan, there were three strategies identified that were sort of help mitigate the gentrification issue. Those centered on affordable housing, economic development and local business development, and tracking and evaluation. When we started to dig into this issue, it gets very complex very quickly, and so we have, for now, left behind the business development and the sort of rising commercial rents piece of it as a follow-on piece. And what we're really focused on with this study is the housing impact and how we can do better tracking and evaluation over time. And so with this mapping assessment, and you have a set of maps in front of you that I'll walk you through. But what we wanted to do with this neighborhood typology is to select a few key indicators that really get at the heart or the meaning of what it means about gentrification. And in looking at other studies across the country, we settled on sort of three groups of indicators. And one of them has to do with housing values and how they're changing. And two of them have to do with demographics and who's vulnerable to displacement and how that vulnerability or those populations are changing over time. And what we did with these is we did a fairly simple analysis in that we were doing a census tract level comparison to the citywide averages and looking for concentrations or alignments of these factors. And so when we look at the demographics and we use the 2010 census data, is we were looking, and the four sort of factors that we settled on as people that are vulnerable to displacement are renters, people of color, low income, which we defined at 80% median family income, and people without a bachelor's degree. And we're thinking that this combination is sort of who has the resources or the skill set to be able to respond to an environment with rising housing prices. Howard?
Would you define median family income and what 80% looks like in real terms for, say, a couple?
I will turn to my Uma. What do you got? Is the 80% level? Yeah, so $56,000 is the income level at 80% for a household. Four people. Household of 4 people.
And is that HUD's number? Exactly. Okay, thank you.
So, and it shows up a little better in your packet. This is the second map in your packet. But we did a rather simple analysis where if you had one of those factors, so you were higher than the citywide average, so for renters it's 44% of the households or more in the census tract are renters, you got a point. And so we just sort of looked for the alignment of those factors across the city and sort of drew a line and focused on the areas where you began to see 3 or 4 of these factors in alignment, which are the redder parts of the city. And so you begin to see lots of areas in East Portland, pockets of inner Portland, pockets in the central city. But we were just looking for the alignment of those factors. And then we went and looked at, well, how are those factors changing over time and changing in the direction of sort of increasing gentrification or increasing toward that would be indicative of gentrification. So where are the areas that are the income has increased faster than the citywide average, the education attainment is increased faster, because these rates changed from 2000 to 2010. So we were looking for where are the rates changing faster than how the city changed as a whole. And then again, you know, we look at, and that is going in that direction. We're developing a separate analysis that looked at where are those demographic changes going in the other direction. You know, where is the city, the households getting poorer or losing education attainment?
So if I look at this map and I'm looking at this correctly, if it's not colored, if it's white, these are populations that are taking the gentrification or accumulating the gentrification impacts. And the people that are in red are being displaced, or the neighborhoods in red are being displaced. I mean, they have.
I think the first part is there's a mix. You have a certain, especially sort of in West Portland, census tracts in areas of the city that just sort of stayed the same.
Same, yeah.
Or changed at the same rate the city was changing.
Yes.
Where you see lit up in red are the areas where you saw faster rates of change towards that was indicative of gentrification. The other piece that we don't have you for today is where were the areas changing faster than the city going in the other direction.
But if you take the previous map that look at risk factors and look at the areas that are 0 risk factors or 1, and then the ones that are at 3 or 4, and then kind of overlay the two, you can kind of take out the West Portland because they had 0 factors.
Right.
So then you leave the ones that have the high risk, the 3s and 4s,
Yes,
to the kind of the other direction.
correct.
Okay.
Yeah, and you'll see through all 3 of these presentations today how we begin to use that sort of vulnerability layer as one option for an equity lens that can begin to talk about, whether we're talking about housing or complete neighborhoods or whatever, we can begin to bring that to bear.
So, I mean, and I don't know if you're heading this way, but at the end of the day, you could almost, overlaying this, you could almost kind of draw directional arrows of where people are susceptible to move to, because you know that they can't go, if you know their income levels and other criteria, the factors, you know where they're going, and you know where they're coming from, and you know where areas that they can't go to. I mean, you can kind of box them in, at least within the Portland city limits, not
Yes.
metro
Yeah, it's
or
that
larger.
that directly correlating that movement is you can't quite track it through the data,
It's
but you
general-
can begin to
general
suspect
direction,
that
yeah.
those are the trends that are happening now.
Okay.
So the third piece that we looked at was, well, what was happening in the housing market? And there we were focused on a couple of different factors. One is we were looking for areas with relatively low or moderate values as a sort of indicative where the real estate market might look for opportunity to get in, at the bottom of the market, not at the top of the market. And we were also looking for areas that are adjacent to high value areas or high appreciating areas to try and capture that sort of spillover effect. I may not be able to afford Mississippi Avenue, but if I'm 4, 5, 6 blocks away, I still benefit from that area. And so we were looking at this adjacency factor and looking at areas that were appreciating faster than how the city appreciated as a whole from 2000 to 2010. And no surprises here, you begin to see the sort of the strength of the market in the inner Portland neighborhoods. And you begin to see, which is sort of what we were seeing before the recession in 2007, is you begin to see the outer edges there, along 82nd Avenue and in southeast, sort of the Mount Scott Arletta neighborhood, or even parts of North Portland around St. John's and the Lombard area, that begin to show that sort of they're adjacent to the higher value, higher appreciating areas. And so we combine all of these factors to come up with a neighborhood typology, which is back to the front of your map packet, that really represents a continuum of how a neighborhood goes through sort of a gentrification process dynamic. That early on, there's signs that they're susceptible. So those are areas that currently have sort of vulnerable populations, but we don't quite see the demographic change yet, but they're near areas that are appreciating rapidly. Then you get into the early stages where the demographic change starts to show up. And then the dynamic stage is really where it's happening. We're seeing all of that happen. You've got the real estate values appreciating, you have the demographic change, you still have concentrations of vulnerable populations, and then you begin to see in some of these neighborhoods the late stages or the continued loss neighborhoods. And so this composite map that shows this neighborhood typology really shows these differences, and we also have in crosshatched here what are the vulnerable risk areas, the concentrations of vulnerable populations, and this is where you really see East Portland has a lot of vulnerable populations, but they're not seeing the demographic change in the gentrification direction or the real estate appreciation in a way that when we're focused on the gentrification issue, it does not lead us to think that we need to take action to address that issue out in East Portland yet. And one of the things, and we're, next January we'll get a new batch of census data, so we'll be able to update this analysis and see what's happened over the last 2 or 3 years, to see how the city's changing and tracking over time. What this typology lets us do is, adjust our tools or our response, that we're going to do something a little bit different along 82nd Avenue that's much earlier in the process, and it may be more about community discussion and engagement and awareness than it is, say, in inner North Portland, where they're right in the middle of the dynamic, and that may be more hands-on homeowners assistance, increasing availability of affordable housing, and the Housing Bureau will get into this as part of their opportunity strategy. But this begins to let us we just don't have one hammer in the toolbox. And so the other thing that it allows us to do is, again, when we're looking at major public investments in one of these areas, we know that we need to do more there. And the example that I like to bring up is along Powell, the south side of Powell, those census tracts there sort of highlight as sort of early gentrification risk. We're starting a new project with Metro and TriMet to look at bus rapid transit, high capacity transit investment along Inner Powell and Outer Division. And when we saw the early results of this, we worked with Metro and TriMet to incorporate into their planning process a deeper look and a deeper understanding of what the dynamics are here and what that in transit investment may mean for these vulnerable households in these neighborhoods. And so as that planning process rolls out over the next year and a half, we can have specific discussions about what's going on or what might be the response. And we can pull in the Housing Bureau, or we can work with the REACH CDC to be more active about affordable housing in these areas.
May I comment something? This is really a fantastic study. When you went through the vulnerability categories, you could just put my parents' photo up there. What's so funny is I grew up in Chicago near UIC, which is now one of the most artistic, creative, fantastic places in the country to live. And my parents, when I was a little girl, I was probably 8 years old, got the opportunity to purchase the rental building that we lived in. It had 6 units for $150. My parents didn't understand that they were right next to UIC, that they're right off the train line, that they were right near downtown Chicago. All they saw was the vulnerability of running 6 apartments. And they didn't appreciate the opportunity that had landed on their lap, and it landed on their lap from the city of Chicago. The city of Chicago had a plan that if they had absentee landlords that were not good neighbors, that they would take the property. I don't know what their eminent domain policy was, but they were offering these properties. My parents didn't appreciate that opportunity because they failed the educational component of that to present what could happen. And now they see that neighborhood and it's just mind-blowing. They eventually purchased something in another neighborhood. So, we're in a really innovative city. And I think we're really creative. I think this is a great study that could create great dialogue with, the housing organizations. Like the Portland Housing Center does a really good education on home ownership. This could be a great conversation with PDC because there's great neighborhoods still that we have these vulnerable renters that could be propelled to homeowners if we did something maybe in collaboration with the schools, if we got the schools in on the conversation because they're always using tax dollars or they lose funding because of the structure, if we got businesses in the neighborhood involved to really start pushing this concept that the people that are low income, and we always put in a category of all the negatives, you could be empowered to do this. But we have to change the dialogue where maybe I was that 8-year-old was bringing home a flyer, right?
Right.
Mommy, bye. We're having, no, seriously, we're having all those.
Yeah.
We're having all those back to school night discussions, right now, throughout the public school system and throughout the country. And it would be great if a teacher, a principal said, and here's another kind of presentation for the city of Portland that it might be great opportunities. If you capture 2 or 3 people in that audience, it kind of starts to change the way gentrification, because you're not going to be able to prevent this from happening maybe we could slow it down, but we could do something innovative in Portland.
Yes.
Karen?
So are you okay with?
Are
taking
we
comments, or
at
shall we
the
wait?
comment portion, or are you?
Well, so
before we-
back to the idea that this is a sort of a high-level look at a few select indicators. And as I mentioned with the Powell project, I mean, we always see this when you're going to do a project in one of these areas, you need to do what we call a drill down analysis and take a closer look at what are the demographic dynamics going on in that area. And the example I like to give is, if you look at the differences between Cully and the Boise Elliott neighborhood, they both sort of show up as a magenta on the map. But Cully has a lot of low-income homeowners compared to Boise Elliott having a lot of low-income renters. And your response to that is going to be really different. And so, we think that this larger map helps sort of flag the issue as a concern and signal where we need to take a closer look and have a better understanding with follow-up analysis to figure out what's the right response and what the opportunities are. And then I would just, and so where we're going with this is, as I said, we're using this, we're going to maintain this analysis and update it as new information becomes available. We can use it as part of our project evaluations. We've been in close discussions with PDC and the Housing Bureau, as you'll see in the next presentation, about how we begin to use this and help it inform our strategies. And then there is the new tools piece as we begin to look at what might be appropriate for Portland. Inclusionary zoning is a hot topic right now down in the legislature. There are community development agreements, there's technical assistance. So there's a lot of good ideas out there, no real sort of magic bullets to sort of say this is the one. And so it's part of a community conversation about what's the right fit in the right neighborhood dynamic. And so where we really sort of leave this, and this can be the start of the discussion, is, how does a gentrification strategy fit in our broader set of goals? Again, it's back to you have different needs for different places. How do we, where should we start? Do you start with the people who are at the tail end of the gentrification process, or do you get out ahead of the game? And again, what new policy tools should we implement here? So we can talk about this work for a little bit. It does sort of mesh well with the opportunity strategy that the Housing Bureau talked to you about today. And then you'll see more of this in the complete neighborhood study as well.
Karen?
Yeah, so thanks, Tom. And what's really good to see is that all 3 of these topics today, your name is on all 3 of them. And they I mean, they all do all fit together, as far as I'm concerned, especially for an East Portland conversation. They fit together, and I find this whole thing an amazing conundrum, and it's disturbing to me, because what we have is what I would call a really clear example of a catch-22. You have a bunch of people who are vulnerable, and you've stated what the 4 indicators are of this vulnerability, and they need a place to live that's affordable, that they can raise their kids. So they trot out to East Portland, which is chronically and historically, for years and years, underserved and underinvested in and under-infrastructured. But that's where you can afford to live. So then you get a bunch of people together, once you've lived there, to say, hey, how's about us two? We're in East Portland. We're part of Portland. Why don't we have bike paths? Why don't we have sidewalks? Why don't we have 20-minute connected neighborhoods? And so then people start to notice you, and then they start investing. Well, they haven't started yet, but maybe someday they'll start investing. And then the prices go up, and the value goes up, and the very people who you're trying to serve are then forced out to the next location. And it reminds me of manifest destiny. I mean, is that what we're saying this is? So that's my comment, and I work there and have all my kids there, and I think it's very frustrating. So what I'd like to know is, has the city ever found another city, or maybe one of its own projects, where the other side of gentrification is displacement? So it gentrifies, causing people to leave. They are now displaced. Every year that a child moves, they lose a year of school. 30% of the kids in Park Rose will not be there at the end of the year. So 30% of my 4,000 kids won't be there. They'll be moved out, trying to find jobs and affordable living. It's not good for them. Is there a city, or maybe in our city, where you have a successful program, where you fixed up a neighborhood to the point where it should be, but you didn't displace the people living there? I've never heard of one. So I'm wondering, do we have an example that we could use as a shining model of maybe the way that we should be thinking?
I think part of the answer to that is that there is in the report itself, there's a dozen different examples of some of the tools that some places have used, whether it's Chicago or small cities throughout the United States. And the tools range from, zoning and code issues to rent control, to the kinds of things that Irma was talking about, where sometimes it's real basic education and information that people need, that when the first person knocks on your door to buy your house, even if you are a homeowner, to wait, because someone else is going to knock 6 months later and offer to pay you even more. And so if you are going to move, you should get the most money you can. And if you're not going to move, then you need some tools to be able to, how do you continue to be able to pay your taxes and all the other kinds of things. And so, that's really what you're talking about, is what we've been looking at, and sort of had us go to this point where we said we need to step back and do some real research on this, look at all the opportunities, come up with a list of 28 different ideas of where you can go. It's still really hard, and there are very few cities anywhere that have done a great job in this. And that's why we're trying to get this out, so that this becomes a part of how the Housing Bureau does its work, how the community development corporations, how PDC, how they're all doing their work, so that they're at least looking at these. But we don't have, for example, inclusionary zoning. We don't have that in Oregon.
Well, and that was from East Portland Action Plan. Our housing committee tried to push that with the legislature, and they were, shooed away. So I understand.
It's active now.
But I'm glad that at least, there's an awareness at least. So this is part of our equity lens of the Portland Plan and the work that we are trying to do. So I'm delighted that this is a topic, that this is something that we talk about. There's a great quote that I'm going to quote you, and then I'll stop talking. in a bit called Social Capital in the Cities, Advice to Change Agents by Xavier de Sousa Briggs. And it says these early Yonkers findings, and this was from a court-ordered housing opportunity program, suggest that we make important housing policy choices bearing persistent social realities in mind. Geographic proximity does not a neighbor make, especially when social distance is great. That's a great quote if you think about that, because this is all about social distance between people. And if this is a great city where we say we're into social and gender and racial equity, then these are the kinds of decisions we have to make.
Howard, Chris.
Well, a lot of planning is intention, and when we're talking here about trying to make equity in neighborhoods and plan for that, a lot of it has to do with how we intentionally do that. There are a couple of examples, Karen, when you asked are out there. I'm not sure they qualify, but I'd like to ask you, Tom, whether you think they meet the qualifications. In the Pearl District, some 20 years ago, there was a set-aside for affordable housing. There is today, through the Housing Authority, 5 buildings there that are affordable in a community that is not what I'd call affordable. South Center was, South Waterfront was also planned with that kind of intention until the market collapsed. So the city has done things in the past to encourage equity in how we do things. Now those are vertical kinds of operations where we're creating buildings around affordability, not detached housing. But my question to you had to do a little bit of confusion at the end of your presentation, Tom. What tools are you using? What do you rely on? What are you feeling is a good, accurate representation of how we have to face gentrification, step up and do something before the fact?
So, as you mentioned, that one of our best tools is the Housing Set-Aside Program through PDC and the Housing Bureau as a way, and in the report, we have an overlay that shows these neighborhoods with the urban renewal areas and the neighborhood economic development areas overlaying on that show how you begin to get some alignment there in terms of where those programs are. The other tool that we have, and last year we went through a whole discussion about the limited tax exemption for affordable housing in that program, and where you focus and target it. I mean, this would be a way where you might focus that tool even further. Where we were a year ago was we applied it to most of our mixed-use centers and corridors throughout the city. Well, maybe we should further target that into some of these areas that are most at risk, especially if we only have a cap of $1 million a year of value to disperse for projects, or we give projects in these areas more priority than other projects in the city. I mean, those are examples of some of the tools that we can begin to use here as well. Or, it can be, working with, or as Irma was saying, this is an education tool, and, we have lots of other community partners out there that, even if you're better aware of what the data is and where they can become and tailor their programs as well.
Chris?
So first a question about the time constants here. So this is a snapshot. If this were a movie and we were looking at this in 1-year intervals, how fast would the colors be changing?
Mm. Yeah, we'll know next spring when we get sort of the last 2 years of data and be able to see how things change across the city. We haven't had time to look further back and see, well, because we know a lot of change occurred from 1990 to 2000. Right. We captured a little bit of that in the housing market analysis in terms of rapidly appreciating areas, but we didn't push the demographic analysis back that far. It's just sort of a time resource thing. But yes, you're right. It is snapshot, and we could begin to look at how that is changing.
Yeah, that obviously drives how we plan for this. How much lead time do we have to get in front of some of these things as opposed to be reacting to things? And then my other question, I guess, really goes to governance. The list in the memo of the 28 different tools is eye-opener for me to think about sort of all the things we have available, but, how weak any individual one thing is and how do we get the right package that's effective. So, you mentioned one scenario where we use this data, which is we're planning some big community investment like Bus Rapid Transit on Powell, and we use this to say, are we going to make it worse? But where should the proactive effort to make it better sit? I want to know who's looking at this stuff every month and saying, what can we do this month to make it better? And is that it seems to me that the Housing Bureau, what they're saying is, how do I house some people this month, not how do I head off gentrification, although they do some of that. But the immediate priority is, how do I house people? Is BPS quarterbacking this? Is it somewhere else? Is it some interagency task force that has to live forever? How do we effectively govern this problem and stay on top of it?
One of the things we've done is we've taken it to a group of the, transportation, housing, PDC, the planning and development directors, and we did the same presentation, and we talked about it for probably 2 hours of who does what, who's in the lead, how do we enhance this. And the work from this study went to build on housing. Immediately said, well, we want to use this as part of our housing opportunity look, and PDC is using, so we're trying to share data at a minimum. So in terms of leadership, in terms of, it's our role, I think, as planning and sustainability, to keep the question out in front, to be the nexus for the information to be shared. It's probably not our role to be providing the affordable housing. Obviously, we have a housing bureau for that. But I think we take it pretty seriously that it's our role to keep the question out in front and to provide good basic information so people can make new decisions.
So we're focusing a lot of attention now because we're in the middle of developing the comp plan. So are we going to continue to be the people who keep saying, pay attention month after month after the comp plan is done?
Yeah. Sure.
I mean, I just keep using my example. I know Howard raised his hand. I mean, I was 8 years old, and I remember telling my parents, it's $150. You can own a sixplex. And I think I go back to schools. I mean, the parents listen to the teachers when they say what your children are supposed to be doing on math, science, reading. And I think if there was a partnership, I mean, I see Karen wrote down advocate. I mean, it's not that complicated. I think if you just plant that seed and you give a few of educational tools, the parents are going to be able to fill in the dots. And not every neighborhood is going to get gentrified as quickly as Alberta or Mississippi and some of those neighborhoods. I do think that there's a few things that we can get in front of very easily and very quickly. But it has to be the right people having the right conversation and agreement. Yeah, this is important to us. We don't want the kids to move again this year. It's everybody's benefit. I don't think it's that difficult. I think that if we're smart people, we're an innovative city, we can put something together that at least gets the message out. At least we don't have this meeting and we do nothing because we feel that our hands are tied.
Howard?
Well, since we're all rocket scientists here, we don't have to say it's not rocket science to say that the economic development of the community suggests that gentrification is going to ratchet up quicker as the whole economy improves and slow down when the economy doesn't. So we're in a period now where we should be paying a lot of attention to gentrification because the economy's picking up and people are beginning to make commitments around their housing, and we have to, I think, make accommodations for displacement around that. Like I say, it doesn't take a lot of intelligence to know that there are a lot of good opportunities to buy pretty reasonable housing in Portland right now, and that people ought to be doing that. That means gentrification is going to start kicking in big time. And I think we have to not only look at this intellectually, but look at the statistics out there in the housing market to say things are happening that we got to pay attention to.
Quick question. So in the best practices toolkit with the targeted economic development, is job training part of that?
It could be, yeah. I mean, that's part of that sort of household prosperity strategy. It's both, creating the jobs for the opportunity, but making sure that people have the skill set to
Right,
take advantage of those jobs.
We certainly want to have affordable housing. I think part of it is helping people raise their income level so they aren't as vulnerable and they aren't in this perpetual state of, am I going to be able to afford, to continue to live here?
So, Tom, I had a question, and then I've got a comment. But you had said on this map that's up there that East County is vulnerable, but doesn't have any risk factors at this time. I mean, it's not gentrifying,
Right.
correct? And so,
So let's get in front of it.
what, yeah.
I mean, I
It seemed
hate
to
to
me,
see that.
I know that,
Well, on that end of it
and
now.
this is kind of a discussion to me and kind of points out something that was evident last year when we kind of looked at the mapping process of where we're going to apply people in the future. And it seems to me the yellow is the firewall to East County, East Portland. And the fact that no one's out there gentrifying today, and we may find out better information in the future, seems to me it's a principle of maintenance. If you think about maintenance of anything, it's cheaper to maintain it than to fix it. And so the red places, the blue places continue. We've heard from the Housing Bureau, it's really expensive to come into downtown Portland and put in affordable housing because the land is really expensive and you don't get much for your bang for your buck. It seems to me if we can get policies in place and actions out in East Portland now and get that policy, we've got limited resources. So it's kind of, do we save one egg or do we save a whole part of a city and maybe let the one go, but we can save the other with more, we can get more bang for our buck. It also indicates that after this, they're not in Portland. That the long term is if we don't build the firewall, we don't do something out there, there's nowhere for them to go in Portland because there's no neighborhoods left. And so I guess as you look at things, whether you look at Powell or you start looking out, as we look out is how do we, really it's an exercise to me, how do we keep the people that are in the hatched areas that are uncolored that way? If Portland wants to continue to be the livable city, the diversity city that it is today, how do we keep them there? Because we know from what you've shown today that if we don't, they start turning yellow, and by the time they get to blue, they're gone. And we're saving one or two households, we're not saving neighborhoods. And so and it's gonna be expensive. So I think the questions are to save large populations, what tools can we put in place? And kind of for the city as a question mark, do we want to save this large part of Portland as a city because it makes up a large part of our diversity and low income and things, and do we want to put the effort and energy into that as investments with limited resources? And I'm not saying that you don't save some of the other neighborhoods. I'm just saying in terms of policy for a city, do you save one or do you save 1,000? And you only have limited resources. We don't have, and there's plenty of I guess examples if you look at San Francisco, New York, and other cities that are now trying to save and put back people. They're spending a lot of money doing that, and we don't have to do that, at least today, for a large population, it seems. But we need to ask the questions a little bit differently. And the other side is, as we implement this, it's great that we, as Susan said, we want to keep asking the question, but someone's got to hold them accountable. So that if PDC has a housing policy, if the Portland Housing Bureau has a policy, and they're not implementing things but putting in housing that's not effective, who holds them accountable? And, to say, oh, we didn't do that right out in this neighborhood, that's great, but who's going to hold them accountable? And I know those are all uncomfortable questions for probably you, but it's an issue that I think we need to ask those questions, and really that broader question, do we protect this neighborhood? Do we build the firewall at 82nd because it's yellow and say no more, or do we let that thing turn yellow? Because once it turns yellow, you know the drill. And the other side of this, just to close, is I know you're not focused on business, but it seems to me it starts a cycle. The housing, the loss of housing, affordable housing changes a business's clientele. And if you focus on a clientele that are in affordable housing, you may move your store to follow your clients. Somebody else that has a different clientele that is now in that neighborhood moves in. And Williams Avenue is a classic example of that, and Mississippi. So we know that cycle, the business cycle, follows the housing cycle. And so I hope we do come back to the business cycle, because if you preserve the people, you need to figure out a way to preserve the businesses, because the businesses can drive the people, or the people can drive the businesses. I don't think there's a exclusiveness to who's first on that one, but we need to be able to address the business cycle also.
Totally agree. I would just say that your set of questions is a great segue to the housing opportunity strategy.
Well, but it's a
And
broader question. I mean, other than housing, it's how do you protect a significant part of the city? I mean, it really is. If we don't do this right, we literally push them out of. They will not be City of Portland residents. There's nowhere for them to go. I mean, you can't jump across the river and say, go to West Portland. No. I mean, to Karen's point, they're looking for a new home, and that home is not affordable in Portland. And so there's, there may be pockets, but not whole neighborhoods. And so I don't think it's a housing,
but it's part of those decisions, and what the challenge is out in East Portland is to make the community investments to make it a better place to live. And one of the things that we can get into as part of the complete neighborhoods discussion is sort of the idea of creating more better places to live helps relieve some of those pressures.
Yep.
Because right now, that's what part of it's the private investment choices that are driving this.
Yes.
And if you have more attractive places that people want to be, that helps dilute that market influence. At the same time, you got to combine that with, as you improve East Portland and make it a nicer place to live, you got to make it, as Karen was saying, where the people who live there today can realize those benefits and enjoy that environment. They get to stay there.
Yeah. I mean, that really is the key, is how do we get them to stay there? And everybody has a choice, and I don't want to say we want to keep it poor so that poor people have, we want to improve their standard of living, their housing, their schools. I mean, we want to do all those things because that's the right thing to do. But at the same time, we want to make it a desirable place for them to continue to live, work, and raise their children. And that's a tall order. I'm not saying that's kind of panacea in one sense, but it's also clearly, if you don't do this right, somebody's going to sit at this table 20 years from now and say, well, how are we going to get the poor people back into the city?
Well,
I don't know if they're going to say that.
No, they are. That's what San Francisco is
You're going to be
doing.
faced with that question now, really.
Huh?
You're really all going to be faced with that question now in terms of when we're looking at the comp plan and making some choices, because one of the reasons Tom has this job now, it's sort of a new position, is we set up a sort of research and analysis section and pulled people from different parts and put them together who are able to do this kind of work as teams, so we can get better information in front of you. And I think some of the key questions, one of the key questions we're going to be in front of you during the comp plan especially is, and ongoing pretty much forever, is with limited dollars, do you, for example, in housing, spend more but be able to give those people an opportunity to be in a neighborhood that a lot of people want to live in? Or to use those limited dollars and have them go potentially further and provide sidewalks and better, better amenities out on 122nd. And that trade-off's going to be kind of consistent in terms of every decision. And those decisions are going to go through all the different bureaus, pretty consistent. And then the only other thing I'd say is that at your retreat, you all sort of made a really strong statement about not just wanting to look at planning and zoning and code, but wanting to be an advocate.
Yeah.
And the other thing you said was, we can't be an advocate for everything. And there's 100 issues that come through. So, doing a check-in in, a few meetings down the road here, maybe before we meet with PDC, to me seems like a really good idea about, well, what do you want, sort of your legacy of what do you all really want to focus on? And this may be it. It may be something else too, but this may be one of the things you want to think about.
Well, I'm just going to raise my hand for preserving the people in East Portland as my advocacy. I'm not advocating that we take that on as a commission. That's a different story. But it seems to me we really are going to, and I kind of jokingly said, we'll ask that question in 20 years, but you look at major cities that have gone through this process, they're literally figuring out ways to bring people of color, different cultures, different income levels back into a city, and it's extremely expensive, it's extremely divisive, and we have, I think, an opportunity to forward think a little bit and say, how do we preserve and improve that region of our city and the culture and really have this city continue to be very diverse in terms of its populations, cultures, income levels, and it seems to me that makes us richer down the road. But yeah, it's going to be tough choices because you can't do it all.
Just one quick comment.
Yes.
I think we've talked a little bit sort of about, holding the line to protect the residents of East Portland. And I definitely want to protect those residents, but I think ultimately I would like to see more of a mix of income in that area. I'd like to see other people want to live there and just develop policies so that the people that are currently there, their incomes go up, they have more opportunity to stay there. But I don't want it to stay just as it is. I think it benefits the schools, it benefits infrastructure. You can do more LIDs if you've got more neighbors that have more resources. So I'd like to see shift there. It's just being very intentional about it and not giving up what we're not willing to give up.
I agree with that. I'm not.
Yeah.
I'm not advocating.
Right.
I'm just
Fair.
saying that it can if it starts becoming yellow red, the progression and it'll just move very fast. If we can raise all boats, so to speak.
Yes, it's the displacement aspect of that.
Yes.
In the context of a growing, changing city.
Exactly. Well put. Howard, and then we've got to move on.
Well, this is just going back and forth. I agree with Michelle. I think I want to touch on Susan's word, advocacy. Here's a great opportunity before us to really do more than just explore statistics, but come up with some really proactive ideas. I hope that's what this is all about, Tom. I'm not sure what we're hearing here. It's a hearing to do something. What are we going to come away with? And where's the meat of the bones? It says we're gonna go out and get all the artists in the world to come live in Portland because they're the ones that improve communities anyway. We know that. That's a little.
I'll come back with my
Tom,
recommendation.
you solve that problem. Get back to us.
Because I think it's an enormous time for us to take this on. Gentrification is at our faces right now in Portland. At least the New York Times thinks so. So.
Yeah, it is. Thank you, Tom. Appreciate it.
All right.
Hey,
We'll
we weren't
transition.
jumping on you. I think
No,
we were just
no. It's like you
It's
got the message.
engaged us, so to speak. So we'll move on to the housing opportunity strategy.
One of the strategies is to use some paper to get the word out. To continue hammer mill bond in their upward movement.
Exactly. Man, more maps. You want to get started?
Sure.
Hi,
Danielle?
everyone. My name is Danielle Ledesma. I'm with the Portland Housing Bureau. On behalf of our director, Tracy Manning, who's out of town right now, wanted to thank you for giving us this opportunity to present our housing growth and opportunity strategy. I've been in the back of the room listening to your conversation about gentrification, and I think that we've got some policies we'd like to share with you and some ideas that we'd like to talk about, because really building on the great work that you've done with the gentrification study, we wanted to take into account the gentrification study, but also look at opportunity and sort of think about where folks want to live, where folks are living, and try to think about how do we balance our resources and our different tools to help create and promote a more balanced city. So our housing opportunity analysis really was born out of a movement that started at HUD that was called Sustainable Communities, where they wanted to look at how do federal investments in transportation, in the environment, and in housing, how do they interact, and what types of communities are we building? And HUD at the time was of the opinion that by coordinating those types of investments that you make better communities. And so through that work, through that sort of framework, we launched this project. Because at the Bureau, our mission really is on trying to find and trying to make investments in housing options for folks that the market isn't serving. So folks at the lowest end of the income sphere. And we have a racial equity agenda where we're trying to make sure that people of color in Portland have access to our programs, and that in terms of the outcomes that we're trying to ensure happen through our housing interventions, that the outcomes are that there is no disparity in outcome. And so we have, over the years, done a really good job about articulating who it is that we want to serve. It's very clear when people go to our website, when people try to access our services, the who, we've done a really good job of prioritizing. Unfortunately, we can't serve everyone, but we have a good handle on being able to prioritize. Over the years, what has been lost is the where, and we've been opportunistic. With the exception of the 30% set aside where the location is prescribed by urban renewal areas, we've had developers come in who've been funded, and they've been able to, we've funded housing throughout the city. But we haven't necessarily prioritized or even examined the relationship between people and place. And as you all are probably aware, public health has done a lot of great work around examining how, unfortunately, we live in pretty segregated cities throughout the country, and there are some places where your zip code can determine your life outcome, your lifespan. So we have as part of our equity agenda, we have a focus on fair housing and wanting to do what we can to affirmatively further fair housing in the city. And there's been lots of really good debate, robust debate about, are there places where there are concentrations of affordable housing? And is the city, through its investments, inadvertently adding to some of the segregation that may happen by income? So what this report and what this strategy is supposed to do is to help give us a framework to help us do a couple of things. One is to give us a framework to help us figure out what's the right balance of investments, where we are, on the one hand, trying to buy affordability in places that have great amenities, and at the same time preserve affordability in neighborhoods that are changing, or for people who may be at risk of being displaced from those neighborhoods. The second thing that we wanted to accomplish with this report is to help put us housing nerds in our places and recognize that housing, although is amazing and provides a great foundation for someone's lives, may not be the only game in town. And so this report really calls the Bureau and our stakeholders to think about how can we better coordinate with folks who are thinking about transportation, about education, about parks, about health, and how do we create a more comprehensive framework when we think about the types of investments that we're making, and how do we leverage those other investments that the city makes to increase the impact that we want to make. The other thing, I think, a byproduct is, and so I think that by reaching that goal and by sort of thinking about that, it calls us to be advocates. I think I heard someone say, be advocates. It calls us to be advocates, and we may not be advocating for housing as the first thing in each of these areas of the city. There may be a better investment that the city can make. We want to make sure that we're there at the table talking about that, the sort of right mix of investments. The other thing that we know about this report is that it definitely calls into question about how we use our resources and where we make investments. Most of our funding comes from the 30% set aside and is TIF, and there are places that we don't have adequate funding to meet the need. So there are big parts of the city where we have smaller resources to do anything with, and so it does call into question about how can we leverage our resources, how can we think about creating more resources or doing advocacy for increased resources for housing. So that's a little background about what we wanted to achieve with this report. You can let me know if we hit or miss. I wanted to bring some maps. One of the best things about this report has been the ability to work with Susan and her staff. Tom and Uma have been our primary contacts, and they've been really great to work with. Uma is super great at taking a lot of disparate opinions, and we had a lot of opinions, and helping create these really great maps that you're going to see here. So to create this report, we wanted to look at different pieces of information, analyze that, and come up with some recommendations. So the first thing that we did at the City of Portland, believe it or not, we created a committee, a technical advisory committee. And so that is one place where we got information. And so our technical advisory committee was comprised of staff from different bureaus. We tried to move beyond housing expertise. So we had folks from philanthropy, from education, from transportation, from healthcare, and we tried to sort of use them as a sounding board, and also they gave us direction about a lot of the key sort of recommendations that we made. We wanted to ground truth all of our information by working with diverse individuals, and so we drafted off of what staff here at Planning and Sustainability did and used the Diverse Civic Leaders Network. So we engaged in contracts with those 5 organizations, which are Latino Network, URCO, Urban League, Center for Intercultural Organizing, and NAIA Family Center, and we asked them to hold focus groups and to give us feedback about the maps, about housing preferences in general, and about our recommendations, and to make sure that we were hitting on the populations that we wanted to be impacted by this report. And then we also looked at where we've already funded and tried to look at the market before we tried to come up with some information. So before we go into the opportunity maps, I do want to maybe reverse the order that we look at these maps. So if you don't mind, I wanted to show you the last, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 pages that you have, 7 pages that you have. So where it says PHB Homeownership Services, 1983 to 2013. Could we start there, and then we'll just go back. So these 2 maps are the ones we produced that BPS didn't produce. But so this map right here is tells us where we've provided services in homeownership. So that's anything from down payment assistance, homeownership, some limited homeownership development, as well as homeownership education. And it's a heat map, so where it's darker orange are in the areas where we've done the most amount of funding. And so if you'll notice, if I could get you to look there and then look at the gentrification map. So one of the things that we know about anti-displacement and gentrification is that one of the best tools to combat that is by creating long-term homeowners. And so if you look at where we've made homeownership decisions and where we've concentrated that, it has primarily been in that northeast corridor. And so, so some would say you're using the right tool in the right area. Others might say what a happy mistake. And so I think what we want to do is use some of this information from the gentrification study as well as our other maps to make these types of decisions more intentional. This was primarily opportunistic, this investment in here.
What was it?
It,
What was the investment? What did you do?
anything from like down payment
Yeah.
assistance. We did some homeownership development where
Yeah.
we built like row houses, and then a lot of homeownership education, foreclosure prevention.
Not with developers, but with people?
Yes. So twofold here. So I think what we want, one of the products that we want out of this report is to be able to say the next place where we would concentrate or try to make, again, still prioritizing on the people who we know we want to serve, that our mission directs us to. The next place where we would want to focus our homeownership investments might look different and might respond more to some of this map and some of our other maps. And so I think that's one of the opportunities that comes out of this type of consciousness raising that we're doing with our investments.
So I just a real kind of just comment. If I looked at this and I looked at that map, one of the conclusions I'd say is you did a relatively good job, because this thing is not in the late or continued loss up in those neighborhoods. And if you assume the timeframes are about the same, I mean, it could be the blue, which is downtown, where you put no money in, and on the inner northeast, and it's blue, it's gone. And so at least it slowed it, and maybe that's a pat on the back. You didn't stop it, but you slowed it, and that's part of the issue.
I think then there's the question of scale, right? So it's, we're just a bit of the market. There's a large homeownership market that public investment doesn't reach all the way. And then I think there's the sort of like added impact. What would have happened if we had coordinated in a different way with the Portland Development Commission around like storefronts and then homeownership? Could we have had a different impact?
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm not saying it didn't happen. I'm just saying I think there's another story there too.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. So the next map is the rental development funded properties. So the bigger the dot, the red dot, the more units. And you can see that there's primarily the place where we've made these investments has been in urban renewal areas. So if you look at where there's a big there's a big dot in, say, the blue area over there on the east side, that's Gateway. And so that's where we've made some investments. If you look throughout Lentz, we've made some there. And then in Oregon Convention Center, the River District, certainly, what was South Park Blocks and downtown, and then Interstate as well. So that's just a little bit of background of where we funded in the past. And then it's just kind of sporadic throughout the rest of the city. Skip the next map. We'll come back to that map. And then, so I wanted to talk a little bit about the market and sort of who we're called to serve. I think that as the city, and particularly in the Housing Bureau, there's a lot of calls on our resources. We have limited resources. And so when we think about who isn't the market serving, we wanted to think both from a homeownership perspective as well as the rental perspective. So UMA helped us develop these maps, and these are very conservative assumptions. So assuming that you wouldn't spend more than 30% of your income on rent or a housing payment, these are maps that are aimed to show what's the affordability throughout the city for folks at different income levels. So this first map is the bleakest map. We'll move through this, but this, for folks who make 30% of the median family income, that's a family of four making about $20,000, close to $21,000 a year. That's someone making $10 an hour. So you think about the types of jobs of folks who make $10 an hour. There is not a place in the city on the market. That doesn't mean that with subsidy or in one of our units that's funded through the Housing Bureau. But just in terms of the market, there isn't a place where they can afford to rent or buy a home throughout the city.
So let me get this straight. If you're working probably in the service industry, you cannot afford to live in Portland at a 30% level.
That's right.
Without
Huh?
assistance.
Oh, with a
Family
family of four. One income, $20,000.
$20,000 between the family of
Family
four.
of four, yeah,
There's nothing on the market for you.
okay.
Just real quick.
Sure.
Is the gradation just coloration? Or is it imply, it appears it's like getting darker as it goes. forward.
That might be your
Print.
printer. That might be your printer. So the next map looks at folks who are making 60% of the median family income. So this is $20,000 more a year. So folks, family of four making $41,000 a year. This is one income, $20 an hour. Basically what it translates to. So think about who you know that makes $20 an hour. The yellow is parts of towns where you could you could afford to rent someplace. There are some pockets of green where you could afford to buy. And then the red is you can't afford to rent or buy. Okay. And then if you take the next picture, so this is for folks who make 80%. So 80% really is the cutoff for federal funding rules for affordable housing. So we can't really direct any of our federal funds to support anyone making more than 80% of the median family income. So at 80%, pretty much almost everything east of I-205 is you could afford to rent or buy there. The yellow areas are places that you can afford to rent, and there really aren't. Once you're at 80%, there really aren't places that you're taken out of the market for rentals. Which becomes an interesting question, because in terms of making choices, when people talk about the types of housing that are needed in different neighborhoods, where they might ask the Housing Bureau to direct their funding might be, what we really need is rental housing for folks making 80% of the median family income. And if we were to look at this chart, we would say, well, is this something that is this a population that the market isn't serving? Looks like the market is serving that income level, right?
But it's location of where it is.
Oh, there we go. Oh, that's good. That's great. That you fell for it. So we'll come back to that.
Following.
We'll come back to that question. That's good. And then
Before we leave that, we occasionally get lobbied for availability of workforce housing.
Yeah.
So what this says to me is that we have effectively workforce housing everywhere in the city. Is that
that is one interpretation? Yeah.
So,
Well, depending on what you define as workforce housing, there's a lot of debate about what is workforce housing, what levels.
Well, I've had people say workforce is up to 120% of MFI. So.
That's right. Well, if you look at 120, turn the page.
Okay.
The next one is 100%,
Right.
and then it goes on to 120. So, do you remember those overhead projectors where you could kind of put the like over and over? I kind of wish that we could do that, and I'm probably sure Irma probably could. But so I'm going to ask you to recall some of these maps, and we might put them side by side as we go into the opportunity. So let's talk about the question of location, right? So now we know a little bit about the market. We know a little bit about where PHB has served where PHB has made investments in the past. Let's talk about the idea of opportunity. I'm sorry.
Ask
Yes.
one question, and this is maybe a Tom question. When we think about these income levels, when you think about $55,000 a year, you're still talking the family of four. It would be interesting to understand the number of jobs in Portland that meet this qualification in terms of, I'm thinking 55,000, maybe a family of two that have two service level jobs that equate to $10 or $11,000. You get to 24,000, and then you get to 50,000, 55,000. So you're at that. So two income, this is where you get.
Yeah.
One income, this is where you get. And kind of to start looking at the income levels are great, but the population seems to be the drill down of how that stacks. And it's not but because that is then who we know where now potentially, but who do you serve?
Right. Well, sorry.
I was just going to add, and it's not just the number of jobs, but it's the education level required to get those jobs
exactly
as well.
And that's to
as a
Michelle's
key.
point. How do you get a better education? Great.
Well, and I think that's the call for this greater coordination between different bureaus and different entities that are charged with that. So folks living in affordable housing, how do we increase their incomes? Okay, so the next set of maps are opportunity maps. So we worked with, I'm pretty sure you guys might be familiar with some of the opportunity mapping work that's been done throughout the country. Clackamas County and Washington County have developed these opportunity maps. We based them on John Powell's model from the Kirwan Institute. Basically, what we're trying to map out here is where are the places in the city that, by virtue of sort of being in those places, that you ride this escalator to the good life. These are the places where amenities are concentrated in the city of Portland. And so what we did is we worked with UMA and with folks from BPS using the base layers from the Coalition of Livable Futures equity maps. And then we started tinkering with weighting different things based on our tax values, the ground truthing that we did with the DCL folks, to try to paint a picture of where are the good parts of Portland and where do we probably need to make different types of investments. So this was a hard conversation to have, I think, because the first thing that you do is you look at this map and you say, well, where do I live? Where do the people that I care about live? And what does that mean if they're yellow? You know, what does that mean about us as a city, or where we make investments or where we make choices? So we had lots of healthy and robust debate about the development of these maps. And so they're a heat map. So the darker purple means the higher concentration of opportunity. Opportunity has been defined by the indicators that I'll talk to you about. And so when we talk about opportunity, it's proximity to a density of whatever metric we're looking at. So it's both density and proximity that is being measured in these maps. So this first map is the combined indicators. So we have 5 different maps. This is, if you put everything together, this is where you would see sort of like the sum total of all the opportunity. So some folks look at this map and they're like, well, I could have told you that. Some folks, look at that map and they're like, wait a minute, are you sure that has, and so it's an interesting conversation to have. Let's go a little bit deeper into the next opportunity layer. So the first thing that we looked up was employment indicators. Not exactly the question that you're asking, but what this shows here is the concentration of high-wage jobs, a certain percentage of high-wage jobs, also low-wage jobs, and then proximity to adult education centers. And so you'll see that there's, certainly the central city is represented there, and there's a concentration there, but there's also a concentration in Airport Way, and then in the sort of gateway area, that health center is probably why that's showing up there. There's a little bit of concentration, not quite dark purple, on the west side, and I think earlier today we were talking about this with another group, and they sort of said there'd be a big concentration on the west side as well. So the next, any questions, thoughts about this, reactions about this map? Nodded heads, okay. So the next map is transportation indicators. So this is proximity to transit, and we've given different types of public transit different weights. So frequent rail lines, high capacity, and transit centers have given the most weight. And then we sort of go down to weekend onlys, and bike lanes is also one of the lower weights as well. And then so this proximity to transit was 80% of the sort of methodology, with 20% being density of sidewalks. And so given all those together, there are pockets of transportation opportunity. This is probably one of the maps that's more, that has more pockets than some of the other ones. So if you look at along I-205, there are some into the east side, up into North Portland, and certainly on the west side as well.
It's striking to see the contrast between St. John's, the little town itself, and then the concentration along I-5 of opportunity with nothing in the middle. And the middle is where I think the opportunity lies, to be honest with you. I don't know why that didn't show up.
Well,
you know what I mean? In other words, it looks like, well, you know what I'm saying? The little town of St. John's has heavy concentration along I-5, but somewhere in the middle on that peninsula is just, it's
much lighter.
I think
Yeah,
the
so-
opportunity is always really confusing for me. So I always think the word should be amenities and not opportunity. This is where there's a concentration of amenities. It's
Oh, that's
almost the
different.
inverse
That's
of
different.
opportunity.
Ah,
And
that's a
so
whole different word.
I consistently go, why do we call it this? Because to me, it should be a mapping of where the amenities are. It's almost the inverse.
There's no public toilet between St. John's and I-5.
So
That's not true.
the other way that I've seen this presented that maybe is a little more meaningful to me is where you can get in a given period of time from a given location, right? Particularly for job access is important. I mean, it may be great that I have a good sidewalk and there's a bus stop, but if I have to transfer somewhere before I can really get to most of the network, that doesn't necessarily mean a lot. So the amenity is probably less important than the sort of reachability score, and do we have that mapped?
What a great segue. If you turn to the next map.
Okay.
I did not pay Commissioner Smith, but, so this is our map where we look at access to family wage jobs. So this is where you can live, where it would take you less than an hour on public transportation, including transfers. There was a lot of debate about the transfer situation, including transfers, to get to a high wage job, a family wage job.
And family wages at?
I believe it's
like
I think it's
40,
62,000.
no. What? It's 48,000 for a single household earner with 2 kids, 1 infant, 1 school age.
So that,
It's like 80%.
Huh?
Three-person,
three-person
With
house.
one earner, 2 kids, childcare costs in
So
there.
120% for a couple of, is that right?
I think it roughly translates, so if you add another person to a household, it roughly translates to about $68,000 a year, which is about 80% of the median.
80% of the median?
But
Okay.
it's a different number, but we use 80% as kind of.
Okay, I was trying to equate it to.
And there's good work that's being done around sort of looking at sort of housing wage plus transportation, sort of what would it take to take into account transportation costs as well. And Metro is leading that up, so.
So this is just saying if you live in the purple area, you've got a job, you can get to a job that's in 60 minutes.
You can get to lots of jobs.
Lots of jobs in
Yeah.
60 minutes.
And this is based mostly on transit, right?
Well, it's transit and job density. It's the combination of
Oh,
those
okay.
two. But it's not bike, it's not PEDs,
It's not SOVs, right? I
it's
mean,
not SOVs.
60% of the population still uses an SOV to get to work, right? So it might be interesting to, this get really complicated, but if you look at the cost to get to a high-wage job, so if you have the ability to trade off a transit pass versus maintaining and operating a vehicle, it might give a little bit more informed picture, given that much as we prefer it not to be the way that most people are still driving to work.
There was a lot of healthy debate about that as well, and I think that folks wanted to focus on public transportation as something that we could influence, or sort of think if there was going to be a new housing development
Opportunity we can
built
provide, yes.
somewhere, how would you take into account access to where their jobs are as a deciding factor in whether or not to fund that? So
And I would just say, we had a great data set from the Brookings Institution
I'll bet.
that made it easy, and we're trying to work with Metro to sort of update this and bring in other factors and be able to play with it better.
The one real question a quick question was, when I look at some of the quote-unquote industrial areas outside of downtown, you look at Swan Island, which has considerably kind of a wasteland for transit, and then look at the port facilities, and it seems to me that you get to opportunity, true opportunity, but just, it seems that there's not alignment of the highway paying jobs and
The
access
the transit.
to where you would say there's industrial jobs that we have.
Yeah, and I think that's part of what these maps illustrate is, when we make choices or, where we make investments in either transportation or housing, sort of looking through the lens of opportunity, might say, to the left, you should locate housing to the left or to the right, or so the next one is healthy eating, active living indicators. And so this is proximity to like park areas, natural areas, the proximity to food sources, and also the proximity to healthcare providers. So in terms of, indicators that might impact someone's, public health indicators, this is the one that was there.
Good cross-section.
Mm-hmm.
It really is. It seems to spread all over the city.
Well, and I think, the high-level map, sort of a more general map, but depending on sort of who you want to serve or what's the population that you're trying to sort of find, amenities for, or, make, do advocacy for, or whatever, you can kind of use each one of these, differently. So the last one is childhood education indicators. And so this one looks at the achievement scores, high school graduation, and then proximity to public schools. And this one there was a lot of good, healthy debate. I keep saying good, healthy debate. There's a lot of healthy debate about this as well. And because a lot of it became sort of, what we know is that people make housing choices, particularly home ownership choices, largely based on the school catchment area. And so it was hard to, so for example, we know that David Douglas School District, for example, has a higher high school graduation rate than the Grant catchment area at this time. However, the home values around Grant are much higher. And so what does that say? And so there was no perfect way to show the multi-layers of the way that housing choices are sort of made through school performance or the reality of the public school system. So this was our best guess. And I think most folks felt like, okay. The yellow flags are just where the Sun schools are. So if you go back to our original question about, so this would say, if we wanted to make investments in rental development to provide very low income people, folks who are formerly homeless, communities of color, folks with, disabilities, access to, park areas, right? We could spend all of our, allocation of funding on just one of these, dark spots and probably not do enough to create as much housing opportunity as we'd like to. So that's one end of the spectrum. It's like, how do we use our funding, our investments to buy affordability in areas that are high in opportunity according to these maps? At the same time, and you talked a little bit about that, about whether or not that would be cost effective. If we spend a lot of money to build, sort of higher density housing in places where land values are high, that's a choice, but we're creating access for folks. So some might say, is there something cost effective, or is there something to be said about having low-income folks who have great access to transit, to high-wage jobs, so that they could maybe move up and out of poverty, or they can have access to healthcare resources so that they stay healthy. So that's one sort of side of the scale that we want to try to balance. The other side being is, if you look at these at the gentrification map, to what extent do we want to preserve affordable housing options for folks who might be displaced as their neighborhood changes around them, particularly because the folks who Lisa Bates, Dr. Bates said were vulnerable are the folks who are squarely in our mission. So how do we sort of find the right balance of investments? And so what we did with all of this information, we looked at all these maps, we looked at this, we looked at our tools, and what we came up with was we looked at the city and we said, we're going to divide the city into 8 areas. And so the map that I told you to come back to, and I feel bad because we haven't had a chance to make it beautiful. So we took Uma's beautiful maps and we created a monster by these are the 8 sections that we divided the city into. And we said, these 8 different areas have characteristics of either high opportunity, have some certain characteristic of opportunity, and have some characteristic of risk for displacement, and have certain resources that are available to them. And based on the combination of those three factors, resources, opportunity, and risk for displacement, we made some recommendations about how to deploy our resources. On the one hand, we want to be able to, do resource development, think about ways that we can get more funding for folks who are low income and people of color. On the other hand, we want to make sure that we're spending our resources wisely and thinking about deploying our tools in a way that leverages the funding that we do have, that creates the maximum impact, and that's cost effective. And so what we start to get to on page, so now more paper. So on page 10 in your packet, here, the report, what we'd like to do is think about our tools in 3 different ways. So basically, this is a chart that says these are the 8 different areas. Yeah, that page right there.
Number?
Yeah, page number 10. Oh, 11, I'm sorry, whoops. Page 11. So what this chart basically says is on the top row, these are the 8 places that we've divided the city into. And then underneath each row is different types of investments. So the most intense type of intervention that the Bureau can do is make a direct investment. And we have program areas in rental development, in homeownership, education, foreclosure prevention, development, and then homelessness prevention, homeless services, and then emergency services. And so we make recommendations about how each of our direct investments might be deployed throughout these different areas. Then the next area is where we sort of think about our sort of policy work and where we spend staff time working with our partners to do, policy and planning. And then this next area is where we might want to look at our indirect investments, like our tax exemptions, as well as thinking about how we can influence other bureaus and other stakeholders to leverage their resources with the resources we've made, or the investments that we might have made in certain areas. So then after page 11 is where we go into a deeper analysis on each of the 8 areas, and we make recommendations. And so we have a little bit more time, and so what I thought we could do is you could pick one of these and we can go a little bit deeper into these, depending on each one of these areas, which one you thought might be interesting, and we can sort of test if the recommendations square with what you saw on the maps. And
Well, I see we have Hayden Island here as an opportunity.
that
Not
is
suggested, I just noted.
That I think is we did a crude. It's really part of the big North Portland swath.
So
Yeah.
I would like to go to page 17.
Page
It says
17.
East Portland, low
Yeah.
opportunity and moderate displacement.
Where's that?
Page 17.
Oh, page 15?
17. 1-7. So I just want to, why is it a low moderate displacement?
So what we did is, if you look at that area, it's considered moderate displacement because if you look on this part of the map, on the gentrification map, that's where we see the hashtag. So that's through Lisa Bates' analysis, that's one of the areas that hasn't necessarily risen as an orange or a pink. It's more, there's some parts that are yellow and the rest are hashtags. That's her reading of the market in terms of moderate risk for displacement.
The logic, so this is the logic of how you're thinking about this. The logic is if you're not on fire, we don't want to help you. I mean, is that it?
No.
You're saying that the people out in East County, because they're not yellow, red, or purple or blue,
Thanks.
they're not there.
Yeah, no, thank you for asking
And then the other
that.
side is that if they are, then they need help.
So thank you for asking that. So I think what we're saying is, in no way do we say that because you don't have one or the other that there would be a disinvestment. What we know about those areas is that in terms of who we want to serve, that there's a concentration of the who that we want to serve at the Bureau.
Yes.
What we're saying is we want to get more savvy, and get more sophisticated on our end about the types of tools that we would use out there. So if you think about the limited resources that we have, a direct investment in new construction rental housing, right? That's the most expensive intervention. That's going to be, that's probably not going to be something that we do in that part of town, simply because the market is providing some options there. What we know about that part of town is that the housing quality isn't where we'd like it to be. So that's going to be one where we would say, because in fact there is a concentration of folks that we want to serve there, we might say we want all of our lead abatement programming to be in this area. We want to just think differently about the way that we invest and the types of tools that we deploy in each area. This isn't, I want to be really clear, this isn't a disinvestment menu for different parts of town.
No.
We're just trying to say that given the different factors, we're going to invest in a different way that's more responsive to both opportunity and to gentrification risk.
I would just make the comment, I think the nomenclature, at least from my, is a real problem.
Real problem.
Because it appears
This is a
that,
killer problem.
and I just jumped to this one because of what we saw there in the previous discussion, that it seems that as a nomenclature, it appears what you're saying it doesn't do, the nomenclature appears that it does, is saying that. I get that you're not saying that, and that's not the intent.
Yeah.
I'm trying to make a point that we need to be clear about what we're actually saying. Okay. Anyway, Karen.
And I want to underline that I am totally confused by the semantics here. Because from everything we've seen in the last 2 hours, this is the opposite. It looks like out of all of these maps upon maps and words upon words, that the investment for housing opportunity is not in the east. It's actually in the west, because the west side has medium opportunity scores and no displacement risk. And then you look at the maps and they're completely purple with high opportunity all in the central city. And I've circled all the other 5 maps where all the yellow is, and it's all in the east. And it's very disconcerting. And I think that some people that I work with on the East Portland Action Plan have looked over these materials and have communicated to me previous to this meeting as their advocate on this team to say that they have grave concerns that it looks like the Housing Bureau is saying exactly the opposite of what you just said.
Sure.
So I think that it's going to be really important to me when I go back to report this at the end of the month to my group, that there's some kind of different way of saying this, because clearly the amenities are not in the east, they're yellow. So then I buy Susan's nomenclature. So I would say the amenities are high on almost every map here, and the opportunities are extremely low. So the opportunity for investment is very high. So that's where I'm having a hard time.
Yeah, I think
It's
that
very confusing.
I think that we would agree. I think the other thing that I would just temper with that is what we've heard from East Portland is that the city has a responsibility to ensure that there's affordable housing options throughout the city. And that I've heard from many folks that some of our indirect investments, some of our opportunity, some of the way that we've made investments in East Portland may have concentrated and inadvertently had an impact on school classroom size in East Portland, particularly in David Douglas. And so where we are trying to go with this type of analysis is to say, you know, because on the market you can get rentals in that area, we probably don't want to make investments in new rental development. What we want to do is work with the community to find ways that we can improve the housing that's there for the low-income people that are there. But our best are in terms of our staff time and where we do policy and planning, where we could be even more effective in terms of East Portland is thinking about how do we work with other bureaus to bring the amenities to East Portland. This is a strategy where we would say, this is an area that doesn't have access to transit, that doesn't have access to highways, jobs. And so, you know, there's a little bit of sort of, there's a way that we want to be able to work with other bureaus that we're thinking about how do we work with them in terms of the timing of our investments, the coordination of our investments, and also hearing from what we've heard from folks is that this isn't, so yes, we can fix the nomenclature and opportunity and amenity, we can fix that. But I think at the end of the day, what we've heard, what we want to do is think about.
What we've heard, you keep saying that.
Sure, what
So
we've heard from
from
folks from
who?
East Portland.
From who?
From legislators in East Portland and from folks from David Douglas School District and from.
Who are certainly
East
not the
Portland
only
Action
people in East
Plan.
Portland. So I'm kind of wondering if you've had a conversation with other people that represent
Sure, I mean, we've,
rental needs in East Portland. I'm not really sure that that's exactly how people feel.
okay.
So.
Go ahead.
So I would say that we're trying to find the right balance. I mean, we certainly don't want folks to think that this is a case for disinvestment. But at the same time, we also, this was our attempt to be humble and sort of think, well, although we know that housing is foundational, there are times when we want to think about, particularly tax increment financing and in URAs, how infrastructure investment can be a catch-22 in terms of creating the scenarios that can lead to displacement. And so what comes first, an investment in storefront improvement or an investment in foreclosure prevention? And how can we work together to ensure that when the city, the Royal City, makes infrastructure investments, that there are good housing resources and an array of our different tools to ensure that folks have access to stay in those neighborhoods. So I think that, and this is a 5-year look, and I think that when we think about what we would do in 5 years versus what we would do over the course of 20 years, things might be different as well. So, is there another part of town that folks want to look? I think we've got.
Are there other questions that you may have for her? Go ahead.
Question/comment. When you're talking about the schools and you're talking about graduation rates and how I think David Douglas had a higher graduation rate than Grant, but Grant housing was more expensive. I would suspect that with a lot of people, if you have the luxury of picking your school, picking your house based on your school, you're assuming your kid's going to graduate and you're looking more at programs. So it's like, does the school have IB? Does the school have, that sort of amenity? I think you'd find more of the connection possibly there than with graduation rates.
That's good.
So how, I guess, what's the next step for this housing opportunity? What's going to happen with it?
So this right here is what we're calling our 90% draft. We're sort of going to different neighborhood associations. We've been to different stakeholder groups through the summer. For the month of September, we're sort of moving through all the different neighborhood associations. And then we'll sort of get to a 99% draft, and then we'll take it to City Council for its adoption. We'll continue to work with our partners at PDC, BPS, to kind of think about how this sets the framework for the way that we make investments.
And
The biggest opportunity is that in the legislature this year, our homeownership tax exemption program used to be constricted by only being able to be used in distressed areas. And and it was Representative Fagan and Representative Vega Peterson from East Portland that said, we really think that you're inadvertently creating this problem by only having it in distressed areas. Wouldn't it be great if you could have homeownership opportunities throughout the city? So they worked really hard to have that portion of the language removed. And so this fall, we'll work to sort of use this framework to try to figure out, well, where do we want to prioritize the tax exemption program? Thinking about the tool that we have in homeownership, thinking about where we might see the intersection between gentrification and opportunity or amenities, and how best to map that out.
Okay. And where could we comment on this?
On our webpage, so we have a webpage. I'll give it to you guys. It's
Julia sent it to us.
yes, and then there's a comment section, and feel free to give me a call. I'm happy to make changes.
Okay. Other questions?
All right, thank you.
Tom, you're back.
Tom never left.
Never
Tom
left.
Armstrong
I would
never
just
left.
say, so keep that combined indicator map out, because there's a point to be made here, and it's obviously come up in a lot of our different discussions, and that.
So the next briefing is complete neighborhood analysis with Tom Armstrong. Just
Let me load the next presentation here.
And I really appreciate you all. It's really hard to get into these maps and numbers, and to do it in 20 minutes and pick through it and then start asking questions is a lot. One of the things that's different, I think, than, at least in my experience working at the city, is that the Housing Bureau didn't go to a consultant team. They came and worked with us as partners and had us help map it using the same data that we were using, PDC. So there's a lot more sharing of information and sharing of basic data, which is,
Good.
you know, either we're all wrong or we're all right, hopefully, you know. But at least we're not just each one of us going out and getting a separate consultant with a different set of tools, which is helpful, I think.
Susan, is this material going to be incorporated in the app,
Yes.
this stuff?
Yeah.
Great, that's terrific.
So this next one, I'm going to let Tom introduce, but it'll take you a minute to get into it, but I found it incredibly fascinating, and there's a dozen different stories you can tell from these little blobs once you get to understand it.
So if you recall back to the Portland Plan discussions and 20-minute neighborhoods and our heat map, and that's been a real sort of guiding principle, guiding document to a lot of the Portland Plan discussions and now a lot of the comprehensive plan discussions. And then coming out of the growth scenarios report, which Spencer Williams, associate planner with us, and I went back to our team and began to look at the 20-minute neighborhood, what was our 20-minute neighborhood analysis assessment, and sort of do a refresh of that, partly learning from what we did in the housing opportunity mapping with the Housing Bureau and some of the techniques and methods around density and proximity and that sort of scoring methodology, and sort of bringing that forward and incorporating it into the 20-minute neighborhood or the complete neighborhood analysis. And then, as you will see as we get to this diagram, how we can use that tool going forward in our comprehensive plan discussions about where and what type of investments we make. So, you know, the idea around creating more complete neighborhoods, it has been a theme in a lot of our documents in the Climate Action Plan. There's a lot of benefits across the city through this in terms of reducing carbon emissions, increasing livability, reducing disparities, and it touches on a lot of different themes in terms of you know, the healthy connected city, the diversity of experience and opportunity in the city, and the sort of efficient infrastructure model and sort of how we manage demand on our systems and where we have infrastructure in place versus where we don't. All of these themes are sort of rolled up into this healthy connected city or these complete neighborhoods. And when you start to look at what that means in terms of the bundle of civic and community amenities, access to food, access to parks and recreation, and you know, an emerging theme in our comprehensive plan is resiliency, and taking cues from our climate action plan in terms of what does it mean to be a resilient neighborhood, in terms of, you know, back to sort of the access to jobs theme, or our, you know, and we can begin to incorporate the risk of gentrification into this as well. There's also huge implications for our transportation system. And one of the themes that you'll begin to see here is this notion of a city of short trips, that providing this both access to the transportation system, whether it's transit or the bike network or the pedestrian network, but also where the goods and services and jobs are located throughout the city, and expanding this notion of completeness throughout the city shortens those trips and provides that sort of multiple benefits, both to relief to our transportation system, more efficient use of our infrastructure dollars, as well as the sort of climate benefits that come from that. So we're sort of wrapping all of that into this. There's a lot going on in this idea of complete neighborhoods and the benefits that come out of a strategy of increasing completeness across the city, and how we do that. So to jump in, what the bundle that went into this are transportation options, access to shops and services and community amenities, access to food in particular, and then an additional access to schools and open space. There are other factors that we can bring in and out and look at in different ways, but this is the bundle that we've included for now, and this is very much a work in progress. And as we go through this, you'll see how we've responded to the reactions and comments that we got to the first time around, and how we've improved upon that.
Real quick question for you,
Yeah.
Tom. So when you say access to food, is it both to places to buy food as well as to grow food?
It's mainly about where to buy food.
Okay.
As the sort of overriding element, the sort of daily needs. The community garden aspect of it, is that in the parks
It is in the
layer?
parks
It
layer.
is in the parks layer.
Okay.
So we pick up a little bit of that opportunity there. So some things to keep in mind as we go through this and how it relates to the comprehensive plan. And I think we talked a little bit about this when we were here with you with the growth scenarios report, but the idea or the organizing principles around mixed-use centers and corridors becomes important as these are the areas where you have the high concentrations of amenities or the services, and also where the connections sort of meet each other. And so that leads us, and has been leading us now for 30 years of creating more of these centers and corridors, these highly functioning centers and corridors. And then from there, growing the connections from those areas. So the bundle of indicators that went into this, as opposed to the housing opportunity, we used a similar analysis in terms of looking at walkability, bike access, transit access. We did a little bit different on sort of access to commercial services and food, and a little bit different on parks and recreation in elementary schools as sort of that neighborhood element to it. But we kind of, eventually we wind up with a similar looking map and the same set of questions about the deficiencies of East Portland and the high functioning, high performance, high completeness of the inner neighborhoods. So I just want to walk you through a series of layers here. So this first map is the sidewalk density map. This is where we're looking at, and we have a great GIS data set on streets with sidewalks on both sides of the street, on one side of the street, bits and pieces of sidewalk, and that also a factor in here is sort of the density of the street network, which is the next one, which is street connectivity. If I'm on that sidewalk, is it leading somewhere? Does it connect up to it? And we have another great graphic here at the end of the presentation that shows just the real, especially street connectivity, the stark contrast between East Portland and Inner Portland and what that means in terms of how you get somewhere in the city. We looked at...
Sorry, Tom, can you back up?
Yeah.
Why does downtown score lower than some of the neighborhoods?
What?
Why does downtown score lower than some of the neighborhoods here?
For this one, it shouldn't. I suspect that this is actually the street connectivity map that we used for, that actually feeds into the bike analysis. This is street connectivity at the local street level, so the low traffic streets, as opposed to the entire complete street network that includes the arterials and the collectors and the higher traffic streets. When you drop out the higher traffic streets, especially in terms of you think about bike accessibility, that's where downtown, it has great street connectivity, but you have to battle with the cars.
Right.
And that's why you see that.
So this isn't just purely an intersection density metric or something? It's
No, this actual map, and so when we look at walkability, we're drawing on the complete street network, so downtown rates very highly. When we look at bicycle, the street connectivity is 45% of the weight in here, and that's where we look at sort of low traffic local streets as being an opportunity or a proxy for a better bicycle environment.
I'm with you.
So for each of these, you know, you can't really read it very well in the legend here, and we'll get these maps out to you. But we're doing a proximity measure, so you get points for being closer to a facility, and we also have points system for the quality of a facility. So a bike trail is rating higher than a bike lane. And we worked with PBOT to sort of come up with this sort of hierarchy of facilities and where they rank in terms of sort of creating that low stress for family friendly bike network.
And part of what that's responding to is in a place like East Portland where you have lower street connectivity, the quality of those connections really need to be higher in order to have the impact that people will use them, and we wanted to be able to capture that.
And we did the same with transit in terms of both looking at the distance to access the transit, but also the qualitative difference between access to MAX, to frequent transit, to just a regular bus service, and being able to sort of capture that service quality difference across the city. We did an analysis of access to commercial services, you know, what's available in close proximity to your household. We did a better, I would say, stratification of those commercial services, giving higher weight. One of the criticisms we got last time around was we sort of had equal weight grocery stores with bars and restaurants. And, you know, maybe that as a daily need, that's probably not right. So this time around, we did a better sort of what do you need to have on a daily basis? The grocery stores, the pharmacies, the banks, daycares, and what's nice to have in your neighborhood, the restaurants, the coffee shops, the bars, and sort of get a little bit better sort of idea, the quality of that commercial service that's available. Because access to healthy food is such an important health indicator, we sort of double counted that and came up with a separate food layer that that includes not just the large grocery chain stores, but also the independent grocers, the ethnic markets, the produce stores, and the farmers markets, and sort of weighted in that. And that's a sort of unique data set that we'll maintain and update over time as businesses open and close. But we sort of, there's an added weight, added emphasis on access to food. We've talked about access to recreation and parks, and we worked with the Parks Bureau to really, again, sort of rate each and every park facility on sort of a point scale in terms of, you know, a larger park with more amenities, you know, something that has playing fields and playgrounds and tennis courts and everything, as opposed to just a neighborhood park, pocket park. it's not just access that, oh, I got a little park around the corner, but what's the quality of service that's provided by that park? And came up with a rating scale for that. And then again, you know, the parks does not include the school grounds, which often, unless, you know, out in East Portland, we have a lot of joint facilities that we do count, but in Inner Portland, in PPS, in our recreation, we're not counting those school fields, those school playgrounds in that. And so one of the things that we brought in is the sort of elementary school layer as being sort of the finest grain of sort of being able to not only use those schools for recreation, but also the safe route to school and the ability to walk or bike to school as part of that sort of complete neighborhood component.
So I want to know, Andre, are we able to stop at a map?
No,
or not?
yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so a question that I have is regarding parks, that when we look at the disparities across the city of recreational opportunities for families and kids. And so I'm worried that we are considering school properties and even hydro parks. Are we considering Water Bureau hydro parks? Even
We
though
do,
they're
we
city
do, we
parks?
give it, Carmen, we give it a pretty low rating, I would say.
But they're still included, and so
They're still included, but-
they're still on the map there.
Yeah, but, I mean, we sort of have it's a 1 to 3 or 1 to 4 point scale depending on the type of amenity. So you get a small amount of credit for it, but it doesn't, I wouldn't say it would greatly, including the hydro parks, doesn't greatly tip the scale in terms of, again, it's, especially this map, it's so the darker blue areas on this have you have a higher access to the facilities.
And also a higher diversity of park experience. So when
Right,
you look
that's
at
what I'm trying to say.
North Portland,
Yes.
for example, you have a variety of size of parks, parkways, access points to the rivers and
And community center.
the slough down there, and community centers as well. So you get a richness of playfields and community centers and ballparks that make that a really high performance.
I guess what I want to be really careful about is overestimating how many recreational developed opportunities there are in East Portland by counting everything as a park. I'm
Right.
just saying be really careful there, because
Yes.
a lot are underdeveloped, not developed, they're nothing, but they're counting as a park. And I get that you might have rated them, but I think it's really important not to overestimate what's there.
Exactly. Thank you.
Thank you.
So when you roll this all up into a combined, and we gave each of these layers an equal weight, the map hasn't significantly changed. And if you look at the housing opportunity map, kind of looks the same. And, you know, it's the, you know, we can sort of mix and match these different indicators and look at different things, and we keep winding up at the same spot. Which sort of is, well, but it reinforces the investment strategy.
If you overlaid this, like a Grey's Anatomy, going from my nervous system to my intestines to my urinary tract, you would overlay these constantly, and you would see the exact same
Yes.
picture, probably year after year, no doubt, of the fact that really there is just an awful discrepancy. And if you were to overlay and use UMA's maps that are about job opportunity by race and ethnicity, and by poverty, you would also see that these maps would all line up. Clearly, there must be an investment strategy by the city of Portland and Metro and the county to work together to even this playing field without displacing every single person that lives there into Gresham.
Right.
So just really hoping that that happens. I mean, you're painting such a clear picture to me. And if I can just get over the nomenclature issue, which I think I can do.
And we're working on it. We're working on it to make it.
Danielle,
Yes.
so I get it, but I think the picture's pretty clear that something's amiss.
So one of the questions I have, you keep indicating investment strategy. Is there kind of an investment strategy of the past map? Well, no, I mean, this looks at the combined indicators, but not saying, if you looked at the city investments in the past, same time period of all the other maps, here's where South Waterfront was, here's where the Pearl is, here's the Housing Authority's investment of PDC, TIF money, all the money in terms of our strategies of the past, and say, when you look at that and you look at these maps, as Karen said, they all seem to look the same, but if you look at the investment strategies, would it say, yes, we were effective in, because we see these indicators as when we overlay them, so if we make another strategy, we can be relatively, I guess, confident that those investments would be equally.
Right.
And that's, I guess, the nomenclature maybe issue is, opportunity versus opportunity. What is a real opportunity?
One of the things we were asked to do in the budget process over the past few years was what we called budget mapping, was how much of a department's budget was going to different parts of the city. And so that has been done for just a couple of years. And Mayor Hales was looking at, should he continue doing that? What's the value in that? Is it a good idea? Does it not make so much sense for the Water Bureau since they just, it's already all in the ground and they have to spend money where it breaks? Or does it make more sense for transportation and sidewalks than some other things? So they're looking at it right now and are actually asking for comments on whether they should continue doing that.
Well, it seems
I know
to me-
you're asking,
yeah,
can we go
well,
back
I
10
know.
years and look at it?
But it seems to me Water Bureau has, and I know this from past experience, has combined when transportation says, we're going to go out and build a road. Water Bureau runs in with its investment because either they put in extra hydrants, they upgrade their facilities, especially in East County where there's deficiencies, they upgrade their facilities. So the combination, I'm still would be interested in the Water Bureau's following because they contribute to that infrastructure upgrade as everybody else. But it really is around the policy. How much money has a housing bureau and a TIF district and a number of other policies made the direct investment from a transportation standpoint or whatever bureau to implement policies that get you a map that looks like this today.
Right, I think one of the maps that Danielle showed was about the past housing dollars that have gone into the city, but that's just for housing.
That's just for housing, but if you combined the city and you had a city investment map and then laid this on there, I think you would see that the investments, the facilitation of what you see today is a combination of investments and policy.
Yeah, so my 2 cents on the budget mapping question, since I've got to sit through it for 4 years. It has mostly been at the level of kind of the neighborhood coalition. So you can say Outer East, and you can say North Portland, but it's nowhere near as granular as this. So I think that it has not been granular enough to be meaningful, and I think we probably also want to be more selective about what we're tracking. Honestly, I don't think the Water Bureau is the problem. I mean, I haven't heard that there are neighborhoods that say our water pressure is lousy compared to other neighborhoods. I've heard neighborhoods say our sidewalks are lousy compared to other neighborhoods. So we should be focusing on the things where we can measure the disparities, and the disparities are real. So parks, sidewalks, things like that. Yes, there are places where sewers back up into basements more prominently, and those should be tracked. But in general, there's some kinds of infrastructure that there's not a problem. So it should be more focused and more granular would be my input to be useful.
And where can we give that input? Because
Well,
I agree with Chris, and we fought hard to get geographic mapping of the dollars with Mayor Adams, and I'd hate to see it go away.
Right, so we'll be attending a meeting about that, I think it's this next coming week. So as staff, we'll bring this information
should
forward.
email you our thoughts.
Yeah, if you want to do that, that would be great.
Yes, Catherine?
Did you want to circle back on that topic, because I'm going to change it?
Go ahead.
Is that a good thing? Go ahead.
No, we'll come back to where we spend money. So.
I might be channeling Mike here, but one of the pieces that seems missing to me, but is key, at least I have found in my work for complete neighborhoods, is understanding the ecological conditions of the neighborhood. And there's going to be opportunities and obviously challenge with whether a neighborhood has more access to solar or not, whether a neighborhood has more access to perhaps ag land to be able to produce food for itself. Wind, water, all of that, trees. How you kind of rein that in, you could take a pretty big swath or kind of pretty focused, but I think that would be interesting to overlay that as far as maybe more than anything to find opportunities in neighborhoods and how to target those and harness that.
Okay. So what we wanted to show you is sort of two ways that we can use this as a tool to guide our conversations around the comp plan and where we go. And one was around centers and corridors and a sort of the centers as a focal point for our growth management strategy, and sort of we can begin to use this as an assessment tool as to, what does a community need to be more complete, and how that changes across the landscape. And we have two examples here highlighted in red. Up here is these are two sort of town center level intensity. These are new to the map. These are ones where through our process of analysis, we sort of said, hey, wait a minute, the area at Interstate in Killingsworth has a level of density, a level of activity that is equal to Hollywood or Lentz. And we should probably start calling this a town center, and we should probably get credit for it, and we should probably tell Metro to start calling it a town center, so that, they give it the same weight and priority as other places. The same is true of Division and 122nd, and that both of these places have that density, both existing as well as planned or planned zone capacity to be that level, that intensity of a place. But when you look at the two places, and Killingsworth and Interstate is here on the right, this is PCC, and this is Interstate here, and I-5, and this is 122nd and Division and 122nd, and this is Powell. You can just see the street connectivity, the sidewalk. All these little lines are complete sidewalks that don't show up over here. Pretty good concentration, or at least zone capacity, for commercial services in the area. And you've got transit on 122nd and Division. It's frequent bus on Division. It's not quite frequent on, it's good, but it's not frequent on 122nd. But here's a case where, this is a pretty high, fairly complete, highly functioning, high opportunity area, and this is missing a lot of those pieces. And a lot of it gets down to local connectivity.
Meaning you'd prioritize Killingsworth over Division, right?
Meaning that you can grow in Killingsworth and know that there's a lot of infrastructure already in place.
Or you
if
can really put some energy into Division, and
if you want to grow in Division,
Need more public investment.
but that's what I think we're looking for
Yes.
you to come to us and say,
Yes.
here's what's the better bang for the buck here.
which is the handout that we just gave you, which is the way we start to organize. You like how that's set up?
You're good.
So this is a way where we can put all of these pieces together and start looking at this. So across the bottom is where we think we might be in 2035 in terms of population. So this is existing plus growth. So over here are the higher density, higher population areas. You have Central City, you have Gateway, you have the Northwest District, Hollywood. Down here, these are the smaller centers and with lower population, Hayden Island, Park Rose, Woodstock, Sellwood, Roseway. Along this level is sort of the level of completeness, and we sort of flip this. So at the bottom are the more complete neighborhoods. They have a lot of the infrastructure already in place. At the top are the sort of less complete neighborhoods. The yellow areas on the map. And so you begin to get a cluster of areas, centers, all of which are out in East Portland, that are expected to have fairly high population, fairly high needs for completeness. The other thing that we threw up on here is the difference between the shading, the black centers, the darker circles, are areas with high levels of vulnerability from the gentrification study. So if you begin to look at sort of a investment strategy that considers all three, where are we growing, or where do we serve the most people, who has the greatest needs or the most deficiencies, and who is most vulnerable, you begin to sort of focus on these 5 centers as having pretty high priority.
And is Midway 122nd in division?
Yes.
Midway is 122nd in division. You have Lentz. You have the Jade District at 82nd in division. Rosewood is 148th in Stark-ish, and Gateway. And then it leaves you, these other areas out here, we have some different choices. We need to make some strategic investments to begin to move them towards more completeness, and that there may be some opportunities for more ambitious growth. I mean, that's one of the questions is sort of how big do you want to be? What does that look like? So that investment and you begin to sort of get neighborhoods moving in this direction towards here. And down here at the bottom, we have a lot of opportunity to grow and to serve people. Most of these are in the inner neighborhoods. There's a lot there that we can leverage. The infrastructure need to support the additional growth is probably smaller on the, smaller incremental, fill in some key gaps. But this is a way that we begin to sort of put all of these pieces together to say, some higher priorities are up in this quadrant.
So, and this is not a question to ask, but this is just to ponder. And Danielle, I know you're in the back there, so reconcile this, what you just said, with the housing policy. And I don't need an answer, but it seems that is almost backwards. I mean, either this is wrong or the housing policy is wrong, or I'm looking at it wrong. I mean, I'm just not understanding how.
So if you look at these areas down here, these are the neighborhoods that we expect to grow.
Yes.
That have a high level of completeness.
Yes.
And have higher risk of gentrification. So this is, yes. One of the things that we want to prioritize investment in, and I think these are high opportunity areas. This is where we want to be spending our affordable housing dollars, is down here. Out here, we want to be spending our housing dollars on preserving the affordable housing that already exists, But we really want to be focused on infrastructure that gets these neighborhoods down this scale towards more completeness.
I guess I'm not going to dispute or question infrastructure, but it's if you're talking about priority of investment, whether or not, I guess the priority is if preservation's above displacement, and that's, I guess, a question, not a, do you preserve people, or do you know that they're highly susceptible, and so do you try to do something different? And that's not that's a big question.
That's sort of the question that Danielle and the Housing Bureau is putting out there. A lot of their dollars are tied to the urban renewal areas, and this helps reinforce it. Yeah. But where they have a choice, and you know, there's lots of different housing programs that, you know, whether it's housing rehabilitation that allows somebody to stay in their home versus building new housing. I mean, one of the things is, I think one of the points is that building new rental housing, publicly subsidized rental housing out in East Portland is probably the wrong place, because in a way they're stranded or disconnected from the community services, the community goods, the transportation system that you really need to be a fully functioning, livable neighborhood household. And is that the question we're asking is that the right place if you're to spend? There's better ways to spend your housing dollars on preservation than production.
And to pull back a little bit as well, this is a 5-year strategy versus 25 years of growth.
I get that.
I think that part of our charge is, as we build more complete neighborhoods and increase the attractiveness of those areas, their willingness to appreciate and therefore displace people is something that we have to be mindful of. So as we become more complete in more parts of the city, we have to do that very carefully so that our risk of displacement and gentrification doesn't also increase.
So I guess the question about investment, though, to me is, and Danielle hit up on it, is as you look at investment, I agree, it's probably not building a lot more affordable housing, at least right away, because you're kind of putting them in the desert from a number of other services. But is it the strategy of investment as a combination of infrastructure and other things that may bring services, and those services may be tied to housing, that then give you that complete investment versus saying a housing investment versus a...
I mean, I don't understand how it ends up either or like that.
Yeah, I guess that's the either or question that I'm kind of, it seemed that housing gave us an either or.
The either or.
Yes, I don't know that I heard that it wasn't that they were going to invest in housing in East Portland.
No, I heard they were not.
It's the way they're going to do the investment is different than they would do it, let's say, in the central city. It's a different type of investment. Since there's already a large stock of affordable housing in East Portland, how do you maintain that? How do you help support that so that you don't lose that through the gentrification process while bringing up infrastructure and all that? So it's just a different philosophy. I don't think they're picky necessarily at this, like dollars at this point.
Well, maybe it's nomenclature I'm getting tied up with because it just seems that I agree with everything you've presented here and what you're saying in terms of East Portland and moving people down and getting more services and thinking about the investment strategy and all of and I agree with you that you need to think about it differently and how you do more combinations to do that. But at the same time, it seems the housing is kind of saying, well, we only have to preserve them. And the other people, we have to go and build housing and do things.
Well, again,
if I say build versus preserve, they seem different dollar values.
Out of curiosity, are you getting that from the title on the page that had the East Portland?
No, from what she said. No.
But Spencer was right in that is a 5-year strategy for the Housing Bureau. And if you look at that is the next 5 years and where we are today, and if we continue to track how things change over time, how the risk of gentrification changes over time, that, 5 years from now, when they do a new strategy, that's when, we see how demographics are changing, and that's the opportunity to adjust that and be able to respond to those changes in the marketplace and to be able to shift their strategy. But it's back to, with a limited set of resources, for the next 5 years, where should they prioritize their dollars and to achieve which goals? And they see preservation out in East Portland as the best opportunity there, and production in Inner Portland as sort of the higher need.
I would just also say, I think we've heard plenty of testimony in the past about people not wanting a greater concentration of low-income housing in East Portland. So I think that's consistent with the idea of,
Well, the school districts are
when
saying
you're-
that. I'm not sure the East Portland Action Plan is saying that.
A lot of people are saying that it's too concentrated. I
Right,
hear
and-
that a lot.
as you,
Let's hear
it's what,
Housing.
I hear that a
Don't
lot.
want only tax-abated housing.
right.
Okay, well, let's hear Michelle. Go ahead.
So, but I think the idea is there are different buckets of money. And are you going to focus your sidewalk money on East Portland, so they have the connectivity and they have the transit service and they can get to the jobs? And then this other bucket of money for construction, new construction of affordable housing, do you do that in one of these other areas that already has high connectivity, so you have more people able to realize those amenities?
Joe,
I could
and then
just-
Howard.
Oh, Joe, go ahead.
So the coincidence of topics tonight is this afternoon.
Is it already nighttime?
The windows are closed.
You got up early?
Coincidence of topics is really opportune for us, and the one point I wanted to make is to pick up on something Spencer, I think, noted too. We're in the middle of the comp plan. Comp plan's about growth between now and 2035. And even if you were, in these centers that are shown in this graph here, or this diagram, are where we think growth is going to take place. And when you think about the change in the face of the city over those 25 years, if you were to put up the total amount of money that the city and all of its programs is going to put into the city, compared with the total amount of private investment, because of that development, you're going to see the private development will dwarf the city development. This is strategic, it's shape-giving, it's doing things to set up this private investment for success, so that the private investment doesn't create god-awful places that exploit the people who live there, or just don't deliver the goods in the long run. It does happen fast, but it really happens at a manageable pace. So don't forget the pace of change, if I can make that case. When you look back at the map where we showed interstate versus south, this one. So part of what I heard your clear request tonight is, tell me what we're really going to do. What's investment even mean on the left side of that diagram? Okay.
You got it.
And that's what we're starting to try.
You got it.
We're trying, because we've been saying this for a while, and we're trying to sort of parse that, figure out what that is, okay? Big figures. How much is that? And I'm telling you, it ranges from, it's big. It could be conceivably big. How the heck do you raise that kind of money? And how do you do it over a period of time that can get things in place in advance of the growth that we expect to see? Because even, before the market crisis, we were growing in East Portland, and in spite of the lack of things that we say are important to make it succeed. So it's not that housing dollars aren't part of the mix, they are. I think the first priority is a different sort of type of investment out there, and it's consistent with how you provide the most, in a long-term sense, beneficial, affordable housing to the households who are going to live in it, because having a house in a place where all this stuff is already in place makes your likelihood of your success of your household a little bit better. We got other things to ensure or try to increase the success of the households in East Portland, and that's why there's two tracks here. It's not because one place is better than the other. It's not that both places are not deserving. In one part of town, we can manage growth. and try to make it succeed. Supplement it with how the limited, ridiculously limited amount of housing resources we really have in the big scheme of things, and deliver good for both the place, mixed income place, and the households who live there. And in East Portland, we got to raise a chunk of change to make these investments. And even then, it's going to take us a while to do that and take us a while to marshal it. There's things we got to do in the immediate, sooner than that in terms of improving the design and sort of the things we can regulate to improve the development of those housings. But don't forget the time frame. Don't forget, and the other part of this little discussion is, as we are going to pay attention to and worry about gentrification, and I don't have an answer for you this afternoon, so don't, but that difference between public investment and private investment, part of private investment is going to look like gentrification. Part of what we're counting on happening in East Portland to help bring amenity to the households who live in East Portland is that private investment. There's a tension there. There's a dilemma, right? And we got to, the objectives we've set ourselves for justice, really, say we're going to try to manage that, the impacts of what this does to the market. We're starting to develop tools to do that, and that's what the gentrification study pointed us to. Some we have, some we don't. We got a lot more to try to develop. It's in that same sort of time frame. That gentrification is not going to happen overnight, but within a decade, we better have an approach and be doing some things, because I think we will see it when the market returns. You're going to see property values and rents go up. So, time frame, gentrification, private investment is our friend. Gentrification presents a dilemma, and we got to manage it.
Howard? Well, thanks, Joe. I'm glad we can talk about this. In a broader picture, I've always struggled with the fact that who led the parade here? There's a series of successful balloons here on the bottom of higher completeness. Of those higher completeness balloons, what did private investment contribute rather than public? Did private investment lead the way, or did it follow? I make the case private investment was the leader in an awful lot of what you see in completion here. My point is, get out of the way and understand what they did that you don't need to do, and then apportion your dollars more creatively for the public part of the participation. Because if I pick out Central City, Northwest District, Hollywood, Killingsworth, I see an awful lot of private investment that made those things happen, not public. Public followed along, public did a little bit, but the private people led the way, Joe. So I'm not accusing, I'm more trying to say, what did we learn from that? We learned that with ingenuity and some affordability, private investors go out and do it. And then the city comes along and says, well, that Killingsworth's a pretty good deal. We better pay attention to it.
An essential difference is when they were developed, too.
Yeah.
I don't disagree. I'm just saying, what do we learn?
Right.
And how do we go forward saying, maybe the better thing is let the private investors continue to put dough in the successful stuff. And I'm just.
Oh, no, I'm absolutely. And we required you to grid, plat, and build a century ago. And that actually created a lot of the sort of bones that we think are so livable now.
Streetcar neighborhoods.
Below that line. And when you look up in that one quadrant, that's a part of town where we did
Northwest Portland
at a different time and under a different set of assumptions and rules. Well, so we got to find a way to create a surrogate for that, because it doesn't seem likely we're going back 100 years. Part of that sort of thing, but you need something.
Just talking about reality.
And it needs to be improved on its own terms too. It's not just making it like inner South.
Karen and Michelle? No.
I think it was very helpful to get some clarification about what it means to put in affordable housing. So that's helped me a bit. I think Michelle's comment helped me understand. I understand better how you don't want to add more affordable city-based housing if you don't have infrastructure. Understand that. I understand how when you have a complete, fairly populous area, like the one on the bottom there with Central City, you could infuse more affordable housing into that because you can afford to. They have the complete neighborhood to do that, and maybe people would benefit from that. My biggest fear And I know that the city, like many school districts, works at a glacial pace for people. And people in East Portland have been waiting a long time, and they're just getting madder and madder. So you should just know that, or maybe you already know that, and some people care and some people don't. But you don't want to add more poor housing. You know, we'd rather have mixed when you're not going to invest in the infrastructure to support these people's lives. You've clearly got 5 black circles up there. There they are. You've got a few to the left, and you've got some, but you've got a quadrant there that is needing infrastructure. All of your maps prove the same point. My fear is that, going back to Andre's point, if the investment strategy isn't overlaid onto this, to add infrastructure to make complete neighborhoods for people that live out in the east, then affordable, not affordable, mixed or not mixed is never going to matter, because you don't really have a place where people can live. You can't walk from my house in Park Rose to a grocery store. I mean, it really doesn't work. It doesn't work for a lot of people. We're getting a sidewalk next to our elementary school for the first time. It goes about 3 blocks. I'm delighted. And I don't poo-poo that, I'm delighted, and I really am delighted. But I just think if we don't marry this, that's why I said either or. It can't be housing or infrastructure. For God's sake, if you're going to build something, build it with the infrastructure that supports it. And so that's kind of why I'm sitting here and why I'm concerned about it. I just want to make sure that when we look at investment strategies, we continue to do that. So I thank you for helping me to understand that connection between the 3 topics better. But I still think we need to fight for more infrastructure.
Other comments? So next steps.
So I think we're going to continue this diagram in particular will be a key feature of the public outreach materials for this upcoming Part 2 draft. A lot of these layers and are part of the MAP app, and being able to look at, you know, different comparisons and that sort of thing. We can do a lot of this type of discussion with a particular community about what the needs are. And then the other thing is, you know, and this sort of goes back to the growth scenarios, is we can also begin to, as we develop the infrastructure investment lists, sort of overlay that or put this in, dump those investments into this analysis and sort of figure out what that means for completeness and how far does that move the needle, and where do those strategic investments mean for each of these areas in terms of moving them up and down the scale.
Okay. Just real quickly, I just want to thank you, Susan, Tom. You guys have done an amazing job with the maps and coordinating with Daniel and housing. I want to thank Daniel for coming too. The maps have been very informative to this group, and I think we're taking a lot away from here today, and hopefully the community sees the benefit of the app and everything. You've done a great job, and,
So I would just like
it's just go ahead.
Thank Neil in the back here. He worked on both sets of maps.
Oh, okay.
For us as part of our GIS team. And done a great job, and it really, you're right, it helps us sort of understand what's going on in our city.
And they're truly informative. I don't think you would have had the conversation today without the maps. So part of the conversation is you were so good that now we got a lot of questions. So thank you.
My comment is mostly about how far we've come over the past couple of years in our discussions, where I think right now, after getting through the Portland plan, that the commission is really focused on East Portland. It's focused on gentrification, and it's focused on infrastructure. And there's some other things too, but those three things keep rising kind of to the top. As we look at what you're going to look at in your free time, then there isn't other things coming to you. We've got, like Andre was mentioning, TriMet's work out in East Portland. So that's infrastructure that we don't directly control in terms of building. It doesn't mean we couldn't. There's been cases of other cities, I'm guessing, where they've put in dollars directly into their transit district to get more transit in their city. So that's always a different way of spending infrastructure dollars. We could have more conversations with them. We could have more conversations with PBOT, deciding what is their infrastructure plan over the next 5 years, where are their dollars going to be spent, and similarly with parks. And so that might be something that you all want to do in terms of having the directors of those bureaus and or staff from those places be able to give you the same kind of information so that you can put it all together. Because a lot of the work that we do is that planning lays out the issues and the problems and some solutions potentially, but we don't run the infrastructure bureaus. And so having them come here, I think, might be of good use to you all to be able to ask some questions that they otherwise might not be asked.
Yeah, I agree.
We're all in favor.
We're all in favor.
That's a good one. That's a good.
That's a good thing, yeah. I don't know how we do that, but how can we help?
They'd come.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just quickly, Susan, there's a new director of transportation
Yes.
here. We haven't met her.
Yep.
I think she's going to have a huge amount of impact on what we're doing. If she's a real ingenious out there weirdo, we could end up with a great transportation system in Portland.
Only if she's weirdo, though?
Absolutely. You can't do straight ahead. You have to do weird. So I'd like to talk to her, and I'd like to have her hear from us what we like on our street.
Right, and I think she would like to come. She's in the midst right now of hiring a new planning director for transportation planning. That's out on the street right now. The applications are coming in. And so when you looked at the job description she wrote, it had the words Portland Plan in there probably 5 different times. And I was so happy. She gave it to me to read the review and to just take a look at it. And I was just so thrilled that they get it. And that for them, land use planning is a key part of their transportation planning. So
I think it could be really exciting if
that's a shift too.
if we get her to change her religion and move toward us, we'll be in good shape.
Yeah. No, I think she's there already. So
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you, and we're adjourned.
Thank you.
She's already had her bicycle stolen.
Yes. There's no fear. I felt like I was.
No, that was-